Dressed in her counselor robe, Amali climbed the steps to the Arenthian for a special meeting called by the Fane. Given that he hadn't attended the Aquila in more than a year, she ought to be mentally hashing through the various reasons to have won now. Instead, Amali was still pondering Macareda's bizarre announcement about her lost soul. Why would she lie about such a thing? Amali wasn't the sort to believe in fairy tales. As an eminent member of the crafting tribe, she'd been groomed from a young age for leadership, a family tradition. Amali exemplified the tenets of her people: practical, sensible, reasonable. This notion of having a soul and being able to lose it wasn't something she had ever seriously considered. She saw the notion of being barred from the afterlife as nothing more than clever propaganda, a fable invented to control society. People would do as they were told because they couldn't afford not to. Amali had always thought that Karatakas, who'd allegedly presented Amali's great-grandmother with Pharaoh's horn, was an invented person. He had to be. At best, she imagined him as a fictitious amalgamation of ideas someone had needed to put a name to. Amali never once considered the fabrication to be true until now. Why would she lie about such a thing? It could be that Macareda was just seeking sympathy. Being still in her second century, she was a child in so many ways. The proclamation was likely a cry for attention, or maybe she's trying to manipulate me. But then it came to the whole. She kept falling into the one that didn't make sense. What if it's actually true? And if so, what about my other assumptions? Amali had no specific evidence that Karatakas didn't exist, and after so many centuries, it was odd that no one in her family had ever let their confidence slip. Surely Glendora would have told her children the truth, wouldn't she? Unless, of course, her great-grandmother had been duped along with everyone else. Perhaps Karatakas was a real person, master swindler who took a common ram's horn and fooled everyone into believing it was magic. This explanation would have satisfied her, if not for the art. Magic should be impossible. But she had witnessed the Fane kill Sephron, watched him punish Macareda's co-conspirators, and had been the personal victim of an enchanted backslap. And what is the horn if not magic? The very foundation of Frey society was based on faith in Pharaoh's law, an idea that was just as absurd, and yet so was the idea of dying. No one could imagine being dead, so invoking it entered the realm of the preposterous. The idea of losing one's soul by violating Pharaoh's law was equally ridiculous. But then someone who is alive dies and death stops being merely an idea. Likewise, when a girl with hollow eyes screams that she's lost her soul, that too changes things. And if the punishment was real, didn't that mean the gods were too? There wasn't any point where a line could be drawn. Is there really a Tetlin witch? Amali was one of the last to arrive, and she took her seat in front next to Volharic. As they waited for the Fane, the Umulan high priest looked as if he hadn't slept in a week. Volharic always looked ancient and drawn, but the old Frey appeared particularly drained that afternoon, a condition that plagued most of the Aquila Hostler, who had recently replaced Sintra as the leader of the Ascendant, sat with hands folded in her lap, head down, as if afraid to meet anyone's eyes. Nanagal, tribal leader of the Elven, brought his work along, busily adding up lists of numbers with his counting frame and measuring stick. Herman, the leader of the Gwydri, appeared the least perturbed. He sat with the stoic blank face of the working tribe, a people unfettered by deep thought. The Dar had a similar stone face, but his was likely a mask, as Amali was fairly certain he knew what the Fane would say. Do you know what this is all about? Volharic asked, as they sat beneath the great dome on stone benches arranged in a semicircle around the Fane's chair. Not a clue, she replied. The Fane doesn't chat over wine and cheese with the curator of the Aquila anymore, thy priest said with a cynical smile. How sad. When was the last time he attended one of your spring sacrifices? Perhaps the Fane's absence is why Pharaoh has forsaken us. Don't think I haven't considered that, Volharic said seriously, looking at the empty chair with a sad frown. And it's not just the Fane. Each year fewer and fewer attend the temple ceremonies. We are becoming a godless people. And when the laws that keep us safe begin and end with our devotion to Pharaoh, I fear we are all living in a house of oil-soaked cloth while playing with sparks. First Macerata, now Volharic. Amali looked up at the smiling image of Caractacus and frowned. The Fane entered and everyone stood. He was dressed in his usual white and gold. The fabric of his assaker was as pristine as ever, but the Frey himself appeared worn. The winter had been hard on him. Lothian had lost a good deal of weight, and his once blonde hair was turning white. Even so, there was a spring in his step and a smile in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Amley didn't know for sure why the Fane had called the meeting, but she had harbored several guesses. Summer had come, and that was the season for warfare. They were well past mid-season, and there had been plenty of time for the runes to advance. Amali half expected that Lothian was going to announce the fall of Avamparth, and that the enemy was only days from marching into Estremladen. There was one other possibility, and the positive look on the Fane's face made her wonder if something truly amazing had happened. Only a week before, she had suggested sending a bird to the room leader with a proposal of peace. Is it possible an agreement has been reached? Is it conceivable that the war is over, my fellow Frey? The Fane began, and everyone under the dome fell silent. I have news regarding the war. With the Astaria LED rune, despite having destroyed their base at Allen Rist, I only wounded the beast, and over the intervening year, it has healed. This spring, they have gone on the offensive and attacked. The Fane didn't sit. Instead, he began to walk, slowly and methodically, back and forth, much like a teacher in front of a class rather than a Fane addressing his subjects. Make no mistake, the Room threat is formidable. They have a massive population, such that even if we kill 10 of them to every one of our lives lost, we will still lose. Furthermore, Durg have given them the secrets to their metals, and the Arinfa, which can negate the weaves of the art. Combined with the training they received from the Astaria, the runes have become extremely dangerous in combat. They have also invented new weapons of war, such as spear throwers and horse-pulled carts. They have proved deadly on the open fields of the High Spear Valley. Yet more than any of these, the biggest threat has come from a dragon. Lothian paused to let this settle, and he appeared a bit disappointed. There wasn't a great gasp of the comment. Everyone knew about the beast, which wasn't really a dragon, but a conjuration of the art. No one who wasn't at the infamous battle knew the full story, but the knowledge that the dragon had tipped the scales in the rune's favor and nearly killed the Fane was widespread. Vidar raised his hand. Where did the dragon come from? Apparently the Merilith representative to the Aquila wasn't as enlightened as Amali had expected. There is some debate on that. The creature was obviously conjured. The question then becomes, by whom? Orion is the only one who could have. Bethane interrupted Vidar. One might think that, except Orion was dead at the time the dragon emerged. Jared and Montalai had killed her the day before. Lothian pointed toward his son, who stood near the door. Wonderly nodded in agreement. This too was common knowledge, and Amali grew impatient. If the Run are marching on Estremaden, you might want to speed up the speech a bit and let people at least get drunk and say goodbye to one another. We believe that the dragon was created by a rune. Interesting, this at least was new. Amali hadn't heard it before, and looking at the other faces under the dome, no one else had either, not even Vidar, who looked livid as he shook his head. That's not possible, the senior counselor blurted out. The rooms are incapable of wielding the art, much less creating a creature of such magnitude. The Fane looked to his son and waved him over to the dais. Wandala took only a few steps, then stopped, leaning in as if he were poking his head through a doorway. It's true, he told the room in a weak voice. I saw her first in Ruin the day First Minister Grindel was killed. At the time I thought it was a trick or a lie spun by Orion, but at Alanris Jared, and I fought her. We think the traitor Orion trained her somehow. Lafayette nodded at his son, and Modelettes shrank back. Thanks to the combination of all these factors, the dragon's protection, their overwhelming numbers, spear throwers and racing carts, our forces have been pushed back to the hardwood. This sounds so dire. So why are you smiling, Lothian? Is it because of a bird? But I come to you this day with good news. It is a bird. As expected, Ruin art has its limitations, and so do the tricks of Insteria warfare. Within the eaves of the great hardwood, the winds of war have shifted the trees forever. Our allies have circumvented their cards, and we have managed to replicate and improve their spear throwers. We have broken up their massive lines, removing the advantage of their numbers. But more than anything, their dragon appears to be nullified. Reports say the beast never strays far from the Rune base camp, which hasn't been moved in over a year. We've concluded it can't progress any farther. The reason isn't known, but the fact remains undeniable. Lothian paused to let the full ramifications of this statement sink in. His smile became a full grin as he spread his arms dramatically. I come to you today to report our forces have won a massive victory in the eaves of the forest. Thousands of runes were killed, and Nephrin was forced to retreat to the safety of his dragon. to lick his many wounds fortunes, have reversed the run can throw their numbers against our bulwark of trees, and we will continue to slaughter them, and once they are weakened and demoralized we will marshal our forces and eliminate the run threat, just as my mother Fenelay delivered us from the Dug. Agwidri entered with a cup and handed it to Lothian, as he did a dozen others moved about the chamber handing out similar cups of wine. Amali took one offered to her by a young Frey with a happy face. Today we celebrate the start of our victory. He raised his cup to the dome. Today we toast the rising dawn of a brighter future. Everyone drank and applauded except Amli, who did neither somehow. She didn't think it would be that easy. It never was. Part 3, Chapter 9, Stalemate. The Battle of the Hardwood began with a series of Frey victories. What followed were years of slow, costly progress that witnessed the deaths of thousands. It ended when our army finally reached the Nidwalden River and the Tower of Avampartha. What should have been a 3-day journey took 5 years. The Book of Bryn. Which one are you? Nefrin asked, pulling off his helm and slapping it on the table. The dwarf looked up. Shock filled his face, and he took a step backward, staring with wide eyes. Did you hear me? Nefrin repeated. Speak up, Lord Nefrin. No, I'm Lord Nefrin. I'm asking for your name. Oh, Flawed, sir. He blinked and began to stroke his beard like it was a magic talisman grown to ward off exactly this kind of confrontation. Well, Flood, I'm here to inspect the bridge, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Okay. The little guy looked terrified. I'm quite certain my brother can give you a tour. And where's he? Over there. Flood pointed toward the river. And what's his name? Frost, sir. That's right, Frost and Flood. Nefrin thought a moment. Did your parents hate you? Flood couldn't find words to reply, and so responded with a shrug. With a shake of his head, Nefrin left the little creature and crossed the bald rock, drawing stares from everyone he passed. He was a golden-haired god trailing a brilliant blue cape, wading through a sweaty herd of filthy laborers. Reaching the eastern side, he entered into the cloud of mist rising from the falls and faced an unparalleled view. The Midwalden River plummeted several hundred feet to a forested world far below. There, the thin blue line meandered lazily to the shimmering green sea on the horizon. He could also see his bridge. The road that had taken years to build through the hardwood continued out across a series of great stone arches that rose up for stories from the river surface and extended across the Nidwalden toward the tower. Beautiful in every detail, it was a masterpiece that only Durg could produce. The span's piers, like the granite slab in the center of the river, were besieged by the water that froths at their feet. The bridge was beautiful, but only a little more. Then halfway to the tower, Nefrin found Frost near the river's edge. This Durg had a white beard and was up on a wooden platform waving a green flag at a host of workmen. The workers in turn operated a wooden arm with a counterweight swinging a massive stone block into place. Frost. Nefrin shouted over the river's roar as he climbed. Frost looked up with a perturbed scowl, then mirrored his brother's shocked expression at the sight of the commander. Your lordship, what are you doing here? Seeing for myself what is taking so long. We are working as hard as we can, I assure you, and yet it's still not done. It's been 5 years I constructed this marvelous road so you could haul slabs from the quarry. I sent you the best masons. I provided everything you asked for, so why isn't it finished? The reports haven't provided sufficient detail. Well, we for Drome's sake. Frost dropped the green flag, pulled out a black one, and waved it at the crews below. The stone was swinging wildly. All those ropes, Frost shouted, to no effect, and then he resorted to pointing with savage jabs. But it didn't appear as if anyone below was looking his way. They aren't putting enough tension on the guidelines. The dwarf held out a blue flag in his right hand and waved a white flag in his left. First up and down, then left and right. No, the idiots, Frost shouted. Draw left, left. You can't. Despite the noise of the river, Nefrin still heard the snap. One of the lines holding the slab broke and whipped back. It hit one man standing on the balustrade. With a sharp cry, he went into the river and was swept over the falls. With only 3 straps clutching the slab, the stone listed sharply, its edges sliced against the remaining ropes, fraying them. Frost dropped his blue and white flags, grabbed up a red one, and waved it frantically over his head. Men fled the bridge, racing for the bank. As the slab's remaining ties snapped and fell, it hit the edge of the previously laid span, chipping at the scaffolding and crane, which were partially tethered to the plummeting stone, were dragged forward. The crane's long arm the size of a massive tree trunk, swept the surface of the bridge clear of everything, including half a dozen workers. Frost threw the red flag on the platform's floor and jumped on it 3 times. Then he pulled on the locks of his beard. That's why it takes so long. The Durg actually growled like a mad dog. Bruins. They don't know what they're doing, even your masons. He said the words sarcastically are nothing more than stone stackers. Most of these idiots were farmers or sword swingers. Until they came here, they aren't builders. They have no idea how to properly heave a stone. And Flodden, I can't be everywhere. He took a long disagreeable breath, frowning as he surveyed the damage on this. This is a good day. At least no one was shot. Usually we lose 2 or 3 workers from arrows launched from the undergrowth, or men just disappear when they go to piss in the woods. Nephren was still looking at the carnage below, where the remains of the splintered crane were wrapped in a tangle of ropes. You are still being attacked on this side. Have you spoken to Tesh? I appointed him forward commander of the Northern Legion. He's responsible for protecting you. His fear of Nephren vanished, and Frost erupted. I spoke to the Primus. He's out there right now hunting, but just as Flood, and I can't be everywhere. Neither can Tesh. He flushes them out, gives chase, but they come back. And then there's the tower, isn't there? Frost extended both hands, presenting a Venpather to Nephron, as if he might not have noticed the massive structure. What about it having idiot laborers is only part of the problem. The tower also interferes. How you use Orin for markings, don't you? Yep, and all of the stone blocks you just watched fall were marked on all 6 sides. So were the crane and the scaffolding. But it isn't easy. Putting the markings on ropes and engraving chains is tedious work. In order to speed up the progress, shortcuts are sometimes taken. You're saying the tower did that? What do you think made the slab sway? Frost took a moment to spit into the falls. They conjure breezes to get them moving. Then if the workers don't get the block under control in time, the mirror leaf cut the rope when it can do the most damage. But like I said, today has gone better than most. How so? No one is allowed near the water without wearing the Orinfa. But it's hot, and the rooms tend to take their shirts off. They paint markings on their skin, but as they sweat, the pattern can smear. You can hear the pops when they explode. It's hard to get a crew back to work after seeing one of their comrades burst like a soap bubble. Sometimes the tower waits and then unleashes a coordinated attack. It sounds like a crackling fire down there when that happens, and no one works for days. After that, our production today is actually quite good, aided by the lowest water level I've seen in months. He pointed. Nephren saw strings of green algae on the tops of normally submerged plants. Usually it's up to the 3rd block of the piers. Frost continued. Being as low as it is, we've been able to lay that forward pier without losing a single life. That's an unheard of achievement. Do we have you to thank for that? Nephren stared at the Durg, puzzled. What are you talking about? The river? You damned it right somewhere upstream. Nephren shook his head. It would take an army of giants to do that. And while there are plenty of Grimoirians up that way, they'd rather kill us than help us. We'd have to start another war with them, and tactically that's not a good idea. Oh, I thought maybe you got Suri to do some magic. Nephren frowned at the very thought. The mystic was a sore spot with him, a festering splinter that defied logic. That child is useless. She's a woman now, isn't she? Whatever she is, she's no help. Refuses to do anything useful. This war could have been over years ago if she'd burned down the forest, dammed up the river, made more dragons, or done any of 100 other things. But she won't lift a finger. I have no idea why she's still around. Frost hung his head, beard first, over the railing of the platform and stared down at the river. I was sure you'd done something. It's so low, and there hasn't been a dry summer or fall. He shook his head. I'd even go so far as to say it's been wet, rained much of last week. Come to think of it, that was when the water level began to drop, which doesn't make any sense. From across the river, Nephren heard a sound, voices rising above the river's roar. Looking over, he spotted a gathering of fray on a balcony. There looked to be as many as 10 each, in a fluttering massacre, completely bald. And looking at him, one pointed. Tet. Nephren cursed, realizing he'd left his helm on the table. He jumped down and ran back toward the cabins, where he'd met Flood. What's going on? Frost asked, chasing after him. Nephren didn't answer. Certain a lightning bolt was on its way. Being so focused on getting his helm, it wasn't until he reached the table that he realized several things weren't right. First, the sky remained clear. Usually the Mary Lee brought in clouds to facilitate their lightning, but the sky was a brilliant autumn blue. Second, everything had become quiet. The rush of water flowing over the falls had stopped. The river was no longer low. It was dry. Frost looked back. "That's not good." His brother Flood shook his head in a rare moment of agreement. "You're right, not good at all." Now the singing from the tower was easily heard, an airy chant that chilled Nephren. "They've been waiting for me." Realizing there was no way they could have known he was coming, he reconsidered. Maybe not waiting, but certainly they're taking advantage of seeing me here. Thunder rolled in from the north. But it wasn't thunder. "What's that?" Blood asked Frost. "If you want to live, follow me," Nephren yelled as he raced down the slope to where his chariot waited. "A brill," he shouted. "Turn around, we're leaving." "What's going on?" Flood asked as all three crowded onto the chariot, and a brill slapped the reins, sending the horse charging back up the forest road. Workers and support crew watched them race by with confused expressions. Others hardly noticed the chariot as they looked north, trying to determine if a storm was coming. A few, the almost smart ones, ran for the shelter of the cabins. "Those wooden boxes will be their coffins," Nephren thought as he urged his driver to whip the animal. The dirge hung tightly to the top rail of the chariot as it raced along the road. Neither was tall enough to see over the cart's sides. "What's that noise?" Flood asked. "Putting rooms on ropes may be difficult," Nephren said, "but it's impossible to put them on water." Behind them came a roar so loud it sounded as if the world was ending. A brill was whipping the horse hard, driving the white stallion to its limit. "I love this road," Nephren thought as they flew across the smooth gravel. Looking back, he saw trees toppling, boulders thrown, dirt and muck churning. "The river is back, but my bridge is gone." No one knew if it had been Nephren or Persephone who came up with the idea of dividing the camp into 4 square sections, each according to its purpose, crafting food preparation, healing, and military strategy. Suri suspected it had been Nephren. He was the sort to think in straight lines and squares rather than circles. But he was a male, and men preferred sharp corners. Women were more inclined to curves, as nothing in nature was ever so rigid. One only needed to see a bubble to understand the nature of Elaine, or her opinion on the subject. The domed tents resembled roundhouses, and their close proximity to the hardwood forest reminded Suri of Dolren, minus the ghastly lodge and wall. She thought the lack of a tree cadaver cage was an improvement. The forest, however, was a different matter. She had visited it only once and hadn't cared for the place. The hardwood was nothing like the Crescent forests Suri came to understand were like people. The Crescent was a friendly, welcoming aunt who smelled of fresh baked bread and greeted you with a hearty hug. The hardwood was a crotchety old uncle who stank of sour milk, grumbled, and spat at his visitors. Still, even an unpleasant uncle was better than no relation at all, and anything was preferable to the desolation of Doria. Persephone's tent stood at the center of the massive encampment where to worn to dirt pathways crossed, dividing the quadrants. Ron referred to it as the hub of the wheel, a phrase Suri liked but didn't understand. Yusufini called it the lodge, which Suri understood but didn't like. The king's tent was a gathering of tied wooden poles and felted cloth, different from the others only in its size, which was large enough to hold 12 people. It was so tall that no one had to stoop, while inside a canopy extended across the front, making a porch. Thick red carpets with floral designs covered most of the area beneath the awning. Everyone seemed to like this except the grass, but turf was only happy when its tassels blew in a summer wind, and that season was over. Small tables, pillows, clay pots, and wooden boxes lay scattered over the rugs. Wood and metal shields hung along the eaves, and a large fire smoldered and smoked out front. Such a practice made Suri wonder about the wisdom of people. To them, fire was a tool, but Suri saw flames as living beasts, wild creatures. She had once invited a squirrel into Torah's home and learned the hard way the nature of untamed things. Fire was far less domesticated and much more destructive than a squirrel habit. The fire tender sat before the ashen ring, watching the glowing coals with a distant expression. He looked up at her approach and smiled. He had a way with smiles. Some people were stingy and managed only smirks. Others grinned a selfish expression full of homemade delight. Habit was different. His were generous gifts of heartfelt happiness. and he appeared to have an inexhaustible supply. Your fire is out, she told him as they both watched the glowing embers. Hubbard's brows furrowed as he slowly shook his head. He raised a finger to his lips, then whispered, "Sleeping." Suri took a second look at the coals, nodded, and whispered back, "My mistake." This made Habit smile all the more. Without a word, he got up, walked around the fire, ring, and hugged her. This wasn't the first time. Habit embraced just about everyone. The simple man wasn't much of a talker, but he was a first-rate squeezer. Still silent, Habit returned to where he'd been, sat down, and stared once more at the coals. Rain was on its way, but you saw no point in telling him. Bad news can always wait. Habit wasn't the only one out front. Two Frey warriors stood to either side of the entrance, dressed in full armor. Each held an intimidating double-bladed spear. They weren't huggers. The Frey in general, and the Estancia in particular, were not prone to open displays of affection. They did occasionally grab each other in a violent back-slapping manner, which so redeemed a good-natured throttle. The Frey were an aloof sort, proud and isolated. Even Orion, who had loved Suri, was strangely reserved, even distant. Suri arrived a few hours after midday. Overhead, gray clouds had rolled in the sort that in another month might hold snow, but for now were only full of rain. Still, she felt they also held a warning of the winter to come, a prophecy. Some predictions were easy. The guards didn't stop Suri or ask questions. For the most part, they did their best to ignore her. She was a Run who wielded the art, and that was as odd as a talking badger. They didn't know what to make of her, and Sari's own people had difficulty figuring her out. When she had been a 14-year-old mystic, they regarded her as a novelty and smiled while shaking their heads occasionally. They laughed after rumors about her leveling a mountain circulated. That novelty had worn off. Still just a child, she was tolerated, but everyone kept a safe distance. Now at 20, after she'd held up the walls of Alan Rist and created a dragon, Suri didn't need the art to sense their terror. Children held their breath at her approach, and men pulled wives back as she passed. How to refer to Suri puzzled the runes, which was too small by a mile and Merrill too foreign. Despite outgrowing the term, they still used mystic, but that title meant something different now. Suri had been expected, and she passed the Frey guards, who reacted with external indifference. Even while the art shouted fear, Suri glanced back at Hubbard. He waved his smile even wider, and the art whispered peace. Such is the difference between intelligence and wisdom, she thought, and for a moment Suri could have sworn she felt a brush of fur against her leg. She looked down, but nothing was there. Suri, Persephone smiled as she entered the tent. Inside, Suri expected to find Nephrin red-faced and demanding once more that she aid his war after news of the bridge's collapse. She anticipated a particularly contentious encounter with him. She was pleased to discover that only Persephone, Bryn, Justine, and Nolan waited. Inside, the queen had dark circles wreathing her eyes, wrinkles, and gray hair had changed the person she used to know into someone else more than older. Persephone appeared weathered, a tree that had suffered many storms and lost so many leaves she couldn't catch the light anymore. She held Nolan on her lap. The little boy was dressed in a rustic shirt and tiny Lee Moore, which followed proper Ruin fashion. He had a bit of drool on his face, smeared across reddened cheeks. Sorry, the child fought his mother. Nolan was bigger than the last time she'd seen him, but still a ball of energy, with a blazing head of yellow hair, bright green eyes, and ruined round ears. "Sorry's here," the boy cried. The moment his little feet hit the floor, he ran to her. The mystic caught him up in a hug, a proper Hubbard-style embrace. Crouching down, she held up an index finger where a single tongue of flame danced off the tip. The boy swiped at it each time his little hands came close. The flame flickered out, only to reappear. "Justine, can you please take Nolan outside?" Persephone asked. "I need to speak to Suri." The boy's nurse approached, but she made no attempt to take the child below. Suri told Nolan. His face lit up, and with bulging cheeks, he sucked in a great breath and blew at her burning finger. The flame winked out, and the boy squealed in delight. Suri smiled at Justine, and the woman snatched the child away as if saving him from the clutches of a rabid bear. She quickly stepped outside, leaving Sora with a Koenig and Brian. Neither of them looked happy. The art provided little insight. All she noticed was noise. Artistically, the camp felt like she was wading into a massive crowd of excited people, all shouting at once. Voices talked over one another, such that only one thing was certain: something major was going on. Something great was about to happen. The art told her that Persephone's tent was the spiritual equivalent of a Crossroads, a decision point not just for her, but perhaps for the entire world. Slowly standing back up, Suri swallowed twice. What is going on? She eyed the king and the keeper of ways. The last time Sari sensed this much significance was in the smithy, when Malcolm had asked her to make another Gillibrand. He was far more than he appeared, but that was she still hadn't figured out. Suri hadn't seen him in years. As far as she knew, no one had. Thinking that this confluence of monumental portents might herald the strange man's return, she took another look around the tent. But Malcolm wasn't there, just Persephone, Bryn, and her. Upon us three the world will spin. I haven't seen you in a while, Persephone began. You look good. You've grown so much. With such momentous apprehension filling the little space, the mundane chit-chat was absurd. Is it possible they can't feel it? I know it's not like what I'm experiencing. Still, I'm sure they sense something. They have to. Matching Persephones. This is just an ordinary visit stance, Suri retorted. So we are playing that old game, are we? The one where you state the obvious, and I'm supposed to do the same. Okay, you look old and tired. Nolan is taller, and Bryn has ink stains on her fingers. How's that? Suri could see it on their faces. Both had that taut pull of someone on the verge of exploding with news. There was also concern, a serious worry about how the meeting would turn out. They had something important to tell her. No, they have something to ask me, but they had no understanding how truly significant what they were about to say would be. Misophonie clearly searched for words. How are Gifford's lessons going? Fine. Can we get to the good part now? The good part. Theophany looked bewildered. You're about to ask me something that will likely change the course of the world, which I have to admit sounds far more exciting than talking about what I had for dinner last night. If that is what you are planning on asking next, I see Nephron isn't here, so I won't be saying number 1,000 times before he catches on. But there is something important you are dying to ask, so what is it? The two exchanged smiles. Bryn shrugged, and Persephone took a breath. Then the king's eyes grew serious. Suri, I sent a message to the Fane during the Battle of Grandford asking for peace. Arian's message. Suri grinned at the news. Yes, exactly. And then we didn't hear a reply for a year. When it finally arrived, the Fane said he was interested. That was 5 years ago, not long after the Battle of the High Plains, which had been a great victory for us. Then it was Nephron's turn to be indifferent, and I'm sorry to say I didn't push. Fortunes reversed in the first Battle of the Harwood, a crushing defeat, and since then we've had 5 years of warring and death on both sides. Nephron can't get his army across the Needwalden, and even though we lose many brave men in the forest raids, our forces remain strong. The Frey are powerless against our numbers, and we are powerless against their river, and so the war goes on. And on. Persephone paused and took a deep breath. Any talk of peace has been silent over these many years, until now. She gestured for Bryn to speak. The method we use to talk to the Fane isn't very sophisticated. Birds are used to carry messages, which must be small and light. Also, the fraying writing consists of a finite set of symbols that represent individual words. It's meant to report simple events or make requests. Complex conversations would require many pigeons that are trained to fly to a stranded on, and those are in short supply. With such a system, it's impossible to negotiate a peace. The keeper revealed a little strip of parchment. This is what has just arrived from the Fane. She unrolled the note and read. Want stop fight meet Avampatha send 1 no send traitor Frey no send rune leader send rune Merilith. Like I said, we only have a few symbols to work with. Bryn apologized. It might not make much sense. She appeared frustrated by her inability to explain, but she shouldn't have worried. Suri understood quite well the process wasn't unlike reading a god's message from chicken bones. The way we've interpreted it, Bryn went on, is that they refuse to discuss anything with Nephron or the other Insteria, whom they most likely see as outlaws. They also don't trust Persephone, probably because they think she incited the war by taking Alan Rist, plus she's human, something they're not exactly comfortable with, but we're guessing they see you as somewhere in between, a ruin they can relate to. They want you to travel to Athenpatera, Persephone said, and you have to go there alone. In some ways that's good. I suspect a delegation would take a long time to reach a consensus. If it's just one-on-one, we'll have a better chance. Eusephone stepped forward and placed her hands on the mystic's shoulders. Suri, you've done so much. You saved my life in the Crescent Forest and our entire party in Neath Wrist would have been overrun without you, and none of that compares to the horror you've had to endure when making one sacrificing." She paused and swallowed hard. "You've done far more than anyone, and I have no right to ask. I'll do it," Suri declared. Bessie appeared taken aback at her sudden acceptance. "Sorry, this is extremely dangerous. You'll be all alone." The mystic nodded. "Sorry, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of Miralith in and around that tower. They could kill you. This could be a ploy. The Fane knows what you are capable of, and this may be a trap to eliminate you. I think you should take some time and think about." "I said I'll do it." Bessie Fane looked frustrated. "I don't think you understand the full." Sari shook her head with Nephrin. "It's all no, no, no. And still he doesn't hear. And now you're deaf to yes, yes, yes." Persephone ran a hand through her hair as if wiping that notion away. "Sorry, I'm only concerned that you might not be thinking this through carefully." "No, that's not it. But it's okay." Suri reached out and took the Kinna's hand. "Trust me, I know a lot about guilt, and you needn't feel any. I'm not going for you or because it's what the Fane requested. I'm doing this because it's my path. This is what Orion saw. This is my Gifford's race. And for once it'll be my own life at risk. That'll be a welcome change." She smiled. "I knew this was coming. I've been waiting for it. Well, not this exactly. But Malcolm asked me to stay, and he said I would know why when the time came. This is it." "Malcolm, what does he have to do with?" "Let's just say I was waiting on the leaves, and now it's my turn to touch the black tree. Orion gave me wings. It's time for me to use them." Chapter 10. The trouble with Trussa, kindness is often as simple as seeing what others choose to ignore. The Book of Bryn. The rain had started to fall before she'd left her meeting with Persephone and Suri, but when it came time to leave, Bryn had been pleased to discover a momentary pause in the downpour. Before reaching her tent, the sound of sobbing caught the keeper's attention, but after chasing it down, she discovered only Trussa. Bryn told herself to keep walking normally. She avoided the older woman. Trussa had never been pleasant, but since the death of her husband she had been worse than horrible. She drank heavily, cursed the gods at every opportunity, and cussed everyone else with her remaining breath. Rumors claimed she threw rocks at men and spit on children. Everyone treated Trussa as a ghost, not merely ignoring her, but going so far as to pretend she didn't exist. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, the woman was dead. Seeing how completely Trussa had been severed from the clan, Bryn almost felt sorry for her, but she stopped short of actually caring, because she knew, as everyone did, that Trussa deserved her fate. No one could prove she had plotted with her husband to kill Persephone, but general opinion held that she should have been executed, or at least exiled. Instead, Persephone showed mercy. The rest of the clan did not. That's how ghosts were made, of living people. But it was Tressa's own fault. That afternoon, Bryn found Trussa in the mud just outside the healing corridor. She was bent over on her hands and knees, sobbing so hard that her body convulsed. The woman's old Breck and Moore had long since rotted off her shoulders, and the ghastly oversized man's shirt that replaced it was soaked. Her hair was matted and hung down into the mud, and bits of grass stuck to her upper arms. Spittle dripped from her mouth, connected to the puddle inches below her face by a liquid string. "It's just Trussa, probably drunk. Keep walking." That's what Bryn told herself. Only her feet refused to move. She'd never seen anyone so miserable before. "Why?" Trussa cried out and slapped the puddle with her fist, causing an explosion. She lifted her head toward the heavy gray clouds and screamed. Was that too much to ask for? "Couldn't you let me have the rest?" of her words were lost to sobs as she clutched her stomach and doubled over, once more wailing into the sudden earth. Bryn remained rooted to the spot, seeing Trussa like this was painful to witness, regardless of what she'd done. "Trussa," Bryn spoke the forbidden word. The despicable woman raised her head in bewilderment. "What's wrong?" The question was foolish. Bryn could guess the woman was no doubt upset that her husband was dead and she left alone, and hated. Still, the question was infinitely better than asking if she were okay. Trussa hadn't been okay in years. She didn't speak, just stared at Bryn and whimpered. On any other day, Bryn might be concerned that Trussa, who was a bit crazy and a lot dangerous, would leap forward and attack. The woman was famous for irrational acts, and at that moment she looked to have gone insane. But in Trussa's red and puffy eyes, Bryn didn't see hate or anger. All she saw was helplessness and exhaustion. In Trussa's dark pupils, Bryn saw her own reflection. "Bryn," Trussa said, "what "Do you want?" Bryn moved closer. "Is there anything I can do?" Still heaving for breath, Tressa shook her head and managed to spit out, "He's dead." Tressa's eyes went wide, and she launched into another wail. For a moment, Bryn thought she was crying again. But then she realized she was mistaken. Tressa pealed with wild, hysterical laughter. "She's finally gone completely insane. A man's fat ass." "No." Tressa said a laughter sputtered, and she hung in a state of limbo, like when a ball thrown upward hovers for a heartbeat before falling back down. Then she started crying again. Then Bryn took another step, inching around the puddle that Tressa didn't appear to notice. With a gasp, Tressa sucked in enough air to reply. "Kelston." She managed a deeper breath. "Bastard. Survived a culling lightning bolt. Lived through the Battle of Granford. But today," she hitched, gasped, and sniffled. "He just kicked off. I found him lying in his bed, his eyes on the tense flap. He seemed like he had been waiting for me, although most of the time the old bastard didn't know who the teddy was." It started raining again, but Bryn hardly noticed. Gelston was her uncle, her father's brother. The day Bryn's parents had died, he survived a lightning strike, but never recovered. Sickly and suffering from a spotty memory, he hadn't recognized Bryn during her infrequent visits. The last time, he called her a sweet bit of honey and grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a mark. After that, she found excuses not to come around. She heard someone was taking care of him, but she never dreamed it was Tressa. "I should be happy, you know," Tessa said, wiping her mouth with the back of a muddy hand. "Nearly 7 years together, and he never once thanked me, even though I cleaned his sheets, cooked, fed, and washed his ass like a baby. When he soiled his pants." Her mouth was hooked in a deep frown as she looked out at the increasing rain. But Tressa began to shake again. "He did hug me once." Her lower lip trembled, and her arms clutched her body as she began to rock. "It was a few years ago, and I can still remember what it was like to feel that at least one person didn't hate me." The sobs returned now. Bryn was crying as well. "I know your mother taught you better than that," Adara told Bryn, as she stood just inside the entrance of their tent, dripping wet and shivering with enough force to churn butter. Bryn looked out at the pouring rain. Gray sheets were coming in at angles across the field, making the tents on the far side of the healing quarter look hazy and washed out. The noise of the storm was loud, a heavy drumming on the canvas. "Get those clothes off." Pedera grabbed a blanket off the bed. "And tell me what happened. Why were you out in such weather?" Bryn began the arduous process of pulling at her wet dress that stubbornly refused to let go. "Galston is dead." "Something kill him." "No," Bryn said while feeling the dress peel away from her goose-flushed skin. "Tressa said he just died, passed away in his bed." "Tressa," Adara said with a suspicious and disapproving tone. "She's been taking care of him. He was my uncle, my blood. But it was Tressa who did all the work, trading his things for mead and ale." "You mean?" "No, it wasn't like that," she said. But then she realized it had been Gelston's shirt that Tressa was wearing. "Oh, you think so, do you?" With Bryn's clothes off, Pedera wrapped a blanket around her and began scrubbing Bryn's hair with a large rag, flinging the water free. "Why? 'Cause that's what she told you." "Did she explain her selflessness over the rim of a nail jug?" Bryn stopped Pedera and looked her in the eye. Tressa was sitting in the mud, sobbing like no one I've ever seen. I think she loved him." Adara's face grimaced, which was something akin to seeing milk curdle. Even struck dumb by lightning, Gelston had better taste than to nod in that way. Bryn finished shaking out her hair since Bedera's hands had moved to the old woman's hips to help make her point. "You had to have been there. It's the saddest thing I ever saw. I can't imagine being so hated. There are good reasons why people hate Tessa, but what I'm saying is that Gelston was all she had in the entire world, and he was the only one, and he couldn't even manage to remember her from one day to the next. Don't you see how pitiful that is? And how would you have felt if she succeeded in killing Persephone? Let's not forget that she did kill Reglan." "No, she didn't. That was Conagus' doing. She was his wife. That doesn't make her guilty, just a poor judge of men. And Persephone could have ordered Tressa's death, but she didn't. If the king doesn't think she's guilty, who are we to judge?" Pedera took Bryn by the shoulders and guided her past the spinning wheel to the bed. The large bag of straw covered in layers of soft woolen blankets whispered as they sat overhead. The rain drummed the cloth roof, and the wind played with the entrance flap. "Persephone is too kind for our own good." That's probably true, but what if she's right? What if Tressa is innocent? Maybe she had no idea what Conager was up to that makes us guilty of punishing An innocent person Adara opened her mouth to protest, but Bryn went on, and even if she helped plant it well, water doesn't retreat from her lips when she needs to drink, and the sun doesn't refuse to shine on her face, so who are we to punish Tressa? It all seems so cruel. You didn't feel this way yesterday. That was before I saw Tressa sobbing in the mud. I used to think of her as a haughty witch who had no right to sit in Persephone's chair, or the one who had fought with my mother and thought Moya should be married to the stump. And now I don't know. Bryn looked back out of the rain, but I do feel sorry for her. She searched Adara's shriveled face. You think I'm being ridiculous, but I'm just a young, stupid, naive girl. Adara drew Bryn's legs up and laid them across her own lap to dry the keeper's feet. First, you're not a girl anymore. You're a grown woman. Second, I think you're a lot like Persephone. Then she shrugged, and I wish the world was filled with more young, stupid, naive women like you two. It'd be a better place if that were so. I'm going to look for her first thing tomorrow. What for the old woman asked to be her friend? Dresser doesn't deserve any, and certainly not one as good as you. I don't care. I wouldn't get your hopes up. Dresser is as stubborn as they come. She doesn't make friends easily. Maybe that's because she hasn't been given the chance, and she doesn't have to do anything. She already has a friend, just doesn't know it yet. As such, I'm going to help her. How you gonna do that? Shove a soul down her throat. Bryn frowned. She doesn't have anything to do now that Gelston is gone. She lacks a purpose, a reason to live like anyone. She needs to feel useful, and that she's making a difference. Having something she's good at will give her pride. Only thing Tressa is good at is drinking. I'm going to give her something else. Bryn smiled. I'll teach her to read. Tressa looked at the neatly piled stack of parchments that measured more than a full hand in height. She'd never seen anything like them. Each sheet was covered with small markings, lines running in rows from one side to the other. Tressa lifted a page, and then another. All of them were beautiful. You made these? The younger woman nodded proudly, like she'd chugged a huge mug of beer without burping or having any come back up. She and Bryn sat on a blanket near the bank of the little creek that ran just to the west of the encampment. The rain from the day before swelled the brook, so it gurgled noisily over the rocks. The keeper had gotten Tressa to come by promising to show her a new dress. Tressa knew there would be strings attached, but was willing to hear what Bryn had in mind. What are they for? Tressa asked. To keep a permanent record so future generations will know what happened. Wouldn't that put you out of work? Bryn shook her head. It'd give me a new job, and you can have one. Do I want to teach you to read, to understand these markings? Wait, you want to make me a keeper? Bryn shook her head. Not exactly, no. I just want to. How long will it take? She eyed the stack warily. Something wasn't adding up. She wanted the dress, but at what cost? Bryn chuckled. You have pressing engagements elsewhere, do you? Maybe not. Tessa said, not liking the woman's attitude. But I want to know what I'm getting into. She touched the stack as if it might bite her. Are you as good as your mother at weaving and sewing? Bryn nodded. Yep, she taught me well. I already have the thread and cloth. Tressa looked at Bryn's garment, made in the traditional wren pattern. Beautiful, neat, clean. Will you dye the thread to match? Sure. Tressa stared longingly at the cloth. Galston's old nightshirt was filthy and ragged, and the holes at the elbows grew bigger every day. When it finally fell apart, she'd have nothing. Not that it matters. No one looks my way. But it did matter. Tressa had fallen so far and so fast. She was surprised she'd survived the drop. She'd been second chair, the chieftain's wife, and now she fought with the camp's dogs for scraps. After her talk with Malcolm, she thought her life would improve. But that was 6 years ago. His parting gift hadn't made a bit of difference. The most valuable thing in the world had failed to live up to its reputation. Malcolm disappeared, and the cage he mentioned never showed up. Maybe it's like what he told Wraith. Maybe the future got altered by someone kicking a falling stone from its expected path. Patrese, nothing had happened. Nothing changed. Yeah, it did. She corrected herself. It got worse. Gelston had died. Tressa was left with a worthless key, a filthy shirt, and her pride, the last two of which were in the same condition. Her dignity was ragged, stained, and falling apart, but she continued to clutch at the remaining shreds, trying to hold them together. Realization dawned. Then Bryn wasn't actually offering to make her a dress. No one gave Tressa anything. Why are you doing this all of a sudden? Is this some kind kind of trick a way to humiliate me, as she said it. The pieces began falling into place. You got others watching there out in the tall grass, aren't they? Got people hiding and sniggering at my stupidity. You're going to try to get me to think. Scribbles can talk just so you can laugh at how pathetic you think I am. You thought I'd do anything for a dress, because all I got is this. She motioned to her filthy oversized shirt. Tressa's throat tightened as if a hand had squeezed it closed. She thought once more of Kelston, of how he'd handed her the shirt off his back. A man who had been hit by lightning and turned into an idiot had showed her more compassion than this. Her face tightened in anger. You're a rotten bitch, just like your mother. That's what you are. Well, you know what you can do with your dress and your Tressa looked at the ridiculous parchments, so meticulously stacked lousy book. Before Bryn could stop her, Tressa grabbed half the stack and threw it toward the river. The individual pages scattered in midair, then settled like fall leaves. Several hit the water and floated away. She expected Bryn to frown in disappointment, because Tressa hadn't fallen for whatever sick and twisted hoax this was supposed to be, but she didn't. Tressa had another handful of pages ready to throw when Bryn screamed in horror. The young woman ran for the stream, and Tressa watched dumbfounded as the keeper nearly killed herself on the jagged rocks of the river's edge. While diving in to save as many pages as she could out of maybe 100, she came away with no more than 20. The rest were lost, snatched away by the swollen current. Bryn pulled herself to shore and collapsed to her knees, half in and half out of the water. She clutched the pages to her heaving chest, crying when she looked back at Tressa, who was still holding the remaining parchment. She began to beg. No, please, Bryn pleaded between sobs. Please don't, please. I've spent so long, I've worked so hard. My parents are in those pages. My family, my Tressa stared at her confused. Bryn wiped her eyes and climbed back up the bank. She didn't say anything else as the keeper pulled the remaining pages from Tressa's hands. Then she gathered them all up in the blanket. As Bryn cradled her bundle, she said, Padera was right, she always is. As new tears fell, she turned and walked back toward her home. Not the end of the world, Adara told Bryn, when the keeper still hadn't gotten out of bed by afternoon of the next day. This was the 8th time she'd said it. You of all people know that worse can happen. What remained of the book of Bryn's diminished stack was still warded in the blanket dropped from the day before. You don't understand, Bryn said, her voice muffled as she spoke into the pillow. This is the 2nd time. My first book was destroyed in Allen wrist, so you already know how to fix it. Now get up and do something about it. Quit feeling sorry for yourself. Go to Rome's, get more ink, and start again. Wallowing here isn't helping anything. The pages aren't the problem. Don't you see? The baffled look on the old woman's face revealed she clearly didn't. Bryn sat up. She was still in her dress that she'd failed to take off the day before, when she crawled into bed, hoping never to see the light of another day. She wished Tesh were there, wanted to feel his arms around her, but he was always gone. As Primus of the Northern Legion, he rarely left the forest for years. Ever since her conversation with Malcolm, Bryn had tried to teach others to read. At first, everyone had been too busy. Afterward, they were still too busy. She'd tried to teach Ryan, figuring she'd be the best at it. Everything went wonderfully at first. Roan understood the system immediately, but she had so little time. Everyone wanted her for something. Tressa was the only person in the camp who didn't have a job to do, because no one wanted to talk to her long enough to assign the miserable woman any tasks. The pages mean nothing, Bryn told Padera. Not if no one can read them. The Frey read. Not really. Their system is for lists and commands, one symbol for one word. It's not flexible, and it's so limited. My marks represent sounds, so anything you can say I can write. The Frey can't read my pages any more than anyone else. Malcolm said my writing could become universal, and in the future, everyone would read my book. But it looks like he was wrong. The mystery disappeared from Padera's face, and the old woman sat down beside her. Tressa didn't just destroy a few pages. She crushed your dream. Tears slipped down Bryn's cheeks as Padera hugged her close. No, it's worse than that. She destroyed our chance at a complete and accurate history. Centuries from now, no one will know what happened. I won't rewrite the pages. I won't ever write again. I can't. Then you really are stupid, Tressa said. They both looked toward the tent flap where Tressa stood silhouetted by the late afternoon light. And you are going to be black and blue once I lay hands on my cudgel, Padera growled and moved to get up. Relax, old hag. I'm not here to cause trouble. You've done nothing else since the day you were born. Padera shot back. Ain't it the truth, but not. Today I just came by, because well here Bryn heard something slap the floor. Looking over the edge of the bed she saw a stack of damp parchments, maybe as many as 50. Don't know if I got them all, but they were all I could find, and I looked pretty hard. Tressa moved back a step, and Bryn could see just how filthy she was. Not just dirty like when they'd last met, but a real sight. The woman was caked in mud. The old shirt of Gelston's was torn in places, and Tressa had scratches along her cheeks, forehead and arms. Some were still bleeding. Anyway, there they are. Tressa turned to leave. Wait, Bryn bolted from the bed. What? Tressa whirled. You want an apology or something? That's the least you could do. Vile drunk. Padera hooted at her. No. Bryn said no. I Bryn rushed to the basket beside the bed and pulled out a bolt of wool cloth woven in the same wren pattern as Bryn's dress. I wanted to know if this would be all right, you know, for your dress. Tressa stood just outside the tent looking back, that same disbelief in her eyes. I mean, assuming you learned to read, of course. Adara made a PST sound which made Tressa shake her head. The old hag is right. I can't learn nothing. It'll be a waste of time for both of us. I'll make it anyway. You can have it if you just try to learn. Tressa narrowed her eyes. Don't be stupid. That doesn't make any sense. The same can be said about you, you blighted curse upon the world. The Dara said you're walking around in stolen thin linen with winter coming on, and this woman is offering to make you as fine a garment as well, better than the likes of you deserve, and you're squawking. If Bren is stupid, you're well, but just ain't no word low enough to describe you. But that's fine, because she shouldn't be wasting her time doing anything nice for the likes of you. So go back to Gelston's tent and curl up next to his cold corpse like the row you are. Tressa's jaw tightened and her arms folded. A defiant stare was shot in Padera's direction, but she spoke to the keeper. Okay, Bryn, sure, you've got a deal. If that old witch doesn't want me to do it, then I'd like nothing better. And that dress had best have a folded hem and low neckline. I'm still young enough to get another man. Bryn smiled as she watched Tressa walk away. When she was across the quad and out of sight, Padera clapped the keeper on the shoulder. No sense in begging when dealing with the likes of Tressa. Say what you will, but she's a fighter, and to get someone like that to do what you want, give them something to battle against. The old woman gave her a wink and a grin. Now go get those wet pages off my floor. Chapter 11. Tech Lords. They fell like leaves in the forest. I had no idea what it was like out there for him. For all of them, I stayed in camp, wrote my book, worked with Tressa, and worried myself sick. The Book of Bryn. The moment the arrows landed, the instant Tesh realized he hadn't been hit, he knew they would survive. He lay on the forest floor, both elbows planted in damp leaves, stomach draped uncomfortably over a tree's root. He peered through the clasped hands of yellowing ferns that quivered with his breath. Overhead, the white feathered arrow meant for him, now a weather vane showing the direction of his enemies, stood out from the mossy bark of the chestnut tree. Tesh had slithered around the base to the safe side, the side without the arrow, where he lay listening, breathing dead leaves and moist dirt. He couldn't tell how many had been hit by the ambush. His men were trained not to cry out. A few had to be dead. It wasn't possible to take a volley like that and not lose at least some. As it turned out, the elves were natural archers and rune soldiers no longer. Warm metal in the hardwood, a lucky pause in his step, was what had saved Tesh's life. Good things sometimes happen. Mostly they didn't, but on rare occasions luck worked magic that even the Orinfa couldn't stop. Pramus. Tesh heard a soft, concerned voice calling from the ferns to his right. Makes Tesh asked, "What should I do, sir?" The words were spit out in a rush, a little slurred, a lot shaken. Meeks was new and far from a full Tekla. Those who fought in Tesh's legion were trained in all 7 disciplines that he'd adapted from the Galantians. The process was considered ridiculous by many, too long, too demanding, and definitely too extreme. Most of his men failed to complete their full apprenticeship over the last 5 years. Only Brigham Killian had achieved what Tesh considered competence in all the disciplines. Those that had at least some proficiency in each were admitted to his elite squadron, the Harwood to Claws, leading to field of fighting force. Tesh was required to send out partially trained soldiers. Meeks was one of those, just 17. This was the kid's first trip into the hardwood. It's difficult to believe I was his age during my first visit to this wretched forest, but I was old even before that day. Dariah, and what The Galentians did to it made me grow up faster than anyone should. First trips to the hardwood were always difficult. Years of training did nothing to prepare the recruits for the reality of the forest and the indescribable terror that accompanied. An invisible foe trying to kill you. Stay low. And on the Tesh looked up south side of a tree. You are behind a tree, right? A rustle come now. Tesh shook his head and marveled that the elves had missed Meeks. The only answer had to be that the boy hadn't been shot at. Good, stay there, no peeking, we're gonna be okay. We aren't dead, Meeks, they always get a free shot, it's the price we pay for finding them. Relax, we're gonna be fine. Sounding like a sudden downpour of hard rain, another bombardment of arrows ripped through the fall leaves. None landed anywhere near Tesh, and he quickly blew 3 loud whistles. On the 3rd note he rolled left and drew both swords. While leaping to his feet he sprinted forward 2 steps, planted a foot, spun left, then ran again. He aimed for big trees, ran right at them, then veered away at the last minute. Either an arrow or a late-season hornet buzzed past his cheek. A moment later another chipped bark of an oak as he rushed past. Definitely not a hornet. The elves who'd ambushed them would be up in the trees on the north side of the trail. Fight, then flight was the elves' best tactic, and sticking to one side of their target made that easier. The one drawback of hiding in a tree was having to climb down to run away. Elves were fast, but not that quick. A maple tree. Tesh focused on the one with the red leaves and a broad set of easy-to-climb limbs. After years of fighting he didn't have to see his enemy to know what was needed. In addition to their position, the fact that only 1 arrow had come at Tesh and none at Meeks meant there were fewer elves than to claws. He guessed for 5 they wouldn't attack with less. The feathers on the arrow had been white. No white birds existed in the hardwood, and white arrows didn't remain that way long. The archer was a new recruit, with the age of elves sent to the war becoming increasingly younger. Tesh could surmise he was fighting a pack of inexperienced kids. Assuming the term kid could apply to someone a few centuries old. Tesh heard a yelp to his right, a high-pitched elven cry. Either one had fallen in his rush to climb down. Unlikely, but he'd seen it happen, or one of his men had beaten the Primus to first blood. His disappointment lifted after he spotted 2 targets in a tiny glade. Pointed ears twitched as their heads snapped around to stare at him. So deer-like, these 2 wore forest green cloaks layered and dyed to blend with foliage. Given that elves had stolen the rune's secret of boughs, Tesh thought it fair play to adopt their deceptive garb. This made it difficult to tell friend from foe, at least until they moved. Frey moved like deer in the quiet span that separated 2 heartbeats. A pair of arrows flew at Tesh. He couldn't see them all. Tesh registered was the twang of boughs. His reaction was instinct and reflex. He cross-sliced over his body with both swords and felt the thrilling snap of wooden shafts clipped between his blades. One was close enough to slap his chest. The 2 elves in shambling green hoods stared with gaping mouths. Your turn, he told them in runic, knowing neither would understand. He didn't care. Tesh only wanted to attract their attention, keep them off balance. That was the important thing when fighting elves, taking away their equilibrium. Without it they were helpless as a cat in a pond, risking a dozen decades of life. These 2 recent immigrants to the bloody hardwood were well spoke, and they never saw Edgar or Atkins taking aim at them. The arrows were nearly silent, and the elves made even less noise when they fell. That's it, Edgar told Tesh, bending down to search the bodies. At 38 Edgar had become the old man, a title made all the more apt by the growing rash of gray in his beard and a cowardly hairline that retreated under his hood. Was the man referred to as his stress line seriously? Fesh asked, disappointed. He looked to the forest, hoping he was wrong. Sorry, Edgar said, handing up the arrows to Atkins. He studied one of the elven boughs, then tossed it away. Kids again, not even 100 years old. I'll bet they didn't linger, leaving the bodies where they lay. The 3 began walking back through the trees toward the trail. Disgusted, Tesh shook his head. This is ridiculous. How many were there? 5, that's all. Tesh frowned. A couple of years ago, gray arrows were behind every tree. You couldn't enter the forest without coming away with blood on your sword. It's like overhunting back home. Adkins said the hardwood was theirs, now it's ours. But it's still dangerous, Edgar declared, pointing to where Meeks lay on the ferns, an arrow in his left eye. He peeked. Tesh sighed. Anyone else? Nope, Edgar reported. Oh well, Brigham took one through The hand, but he'll be okay really. What was he doing waving at them? Edgar shrugged. Never know with him. He's a lot like you. Tesh grinned. He is, isn't he? That's not a compliment. We'll have to agree to disagree. The other new recruit, a melon by the name of Vargas, joined them. Tesh looked around. What about Anwar? With a glance and a nod, Edgar referred him to Atkins, the short southerner, who had grown a partial beard. Tesh was still getting used to was stuffing the captured arrows into his overfull satchel. He's fine. Didn't do anything though, Vargas reported. I was right beside him. Galatians are supposed to be such great warriors, but that fray, just watch, they never do anything, Brigham said as he appeared out of the trees, one bloody hand wrapped in a cloth. Can't defend themselves against their own kind, because their god won't let them. If I were anywhere, I'd be looking for a new god. Does seem a bit asinine, Edgar admitted. Likely why Anwar, Techen, and Nephrin are all that's left of the Galatians. How many were there? Vargas asked. Brigham paused to count. Sebek, Voroth, and Grigor lost their lives in the Battle of Granford. Right, Tesh nodded. And Ares died right here in the hardwoods. So 7, 8, Tesh corrected. There was another one named Medic, Ares's brother. He died in Ren before Granford. He looked around. Where's Anwar tracking the white feathers that got away? Vargas replied that he wanted to see if he could find out where they were crossing the river before long. The others minus Meeks, who was dead, and Horace and Pliny, who were on point and pummeled duty, had gathered around. Anwar was the last to join them. He wasn't a regular member of the Teklaw war band. Tesh had asked him along to help find elves. Anwar had always been the oddly quiet, strangely thoughtful Galantine. His long face, braided hair, and penchant for knots and slings had made him a misfit in that glory-seeking group of framarauders. He didn't drink, never sang, and often prayed for what? Tesh had no idea. What could an elf pray for? Certainly not long life. They'd already been blessed with that. Anwar spent his time tying and untying knots and inventing new ones. He had a childlike fascination with the things, which was evident from the knotted loops of rawhide he wore as necklaces and bracelets, and the elaborate braids in his hair. Tesh guessed the reason for the contrast was that Anwar was the only Frey Lanchan not from the Isteria tribe. Anwar was a Sandwar hunter, and good at tracking anything. Tesh asked the Frey Lanchan. Anwar shook his head and sighed. To bad, Tesh replied with disgust. Guess we better start digging a place for Meeks. Don't we need to get back? Brigham asked while fiddling with the wrapping on his and we have a rendezvous. Remember? Tesh didn't. The mystic, isn't she arriving today? Oh, Teflon's asked. That's right. He looked around and ran a hand through his hair, feeling the sweat. We're already late, aren't we? Brigham nodded. Damn it, all right. Let's head back. What about Meeks? Atkins asked. His South Warwick accent made the name come out as Meeks. He pointed at the body with the last 2 arrows he hadn't found room for in his quiver, but couldn't bear to drop. Can't leave him here. He's dead. I'm not going anywhere. We're already late. If Surya is killed while in my forest, I won't just get crap from Nephrin. I'll be strung up by Persephone and Mora. We need Tibrium Primus. Can't leave Menarut. You want Main's hunting you. Makes would be the type to. Edgar stared down at the dead face, which was a frozen portrait of shocked, spiteful kid. He'll track you down. No time. We'll come back after, Tesh told them. And if we're too late, I'd rather have an undead Meeks on my tail than a live Moya. Tesh spotted the woman standing before the tents. The Tekla's base camp was a miserable cluster of torn, stained, listless shelters. They suffered from inadequate poles and ropes, which left their quarters deflated, and sad, dirty, drying clothes hung on lines. Their stink fought with the campfire smoke for worst smell. Tish wasn't one for tight discipline when in camp, and as a result half-naked men were sprawled everywhere, eating, drinking, and sleeping. The mystic didn't seem to notice. She stood among piles of fly-infested apple rinds and discarded animal bones, looking eastward down the road. Tash hadn't seen the mystic in years. The last time was at Wraith's funeral, but he mostly remembered her from Tyre. He'd been 14 and guessed she was about the same age back then. She'd dressed in odd clothing, talked to animals, and played in the ocean. Suri had become a woman, but still wore strange clothes now. In place of her leather vest and belt made of teeth, she wore the asacre of a frayed mirror leaf. Suri, he called. Sorry, I'm late. Confusion formed on her face. She didn't recognize him. I'm Tesh Primus of the 1st Legion and commander of the Harwood Advance. He pulled off his pack and tossed it on the ground beside the water. Beryl's welcome to our humble home. She looked around at the tents as if just noticing them. I was told you were coming, he said, but try to make your visit as comfortable as possible. Although we lack the comforts you're likely used to at the dragon camp, how far is it to the tower?" she asked the tower. Tesh glanced at Edgar and Brigham, who flanked him as they pulled off gear. Avon Partha Suri clarified, "Oh, don't worry." Tesh offered her a casual wave. "It's too far away to harm us." "How far is it? Can I get there before dark?" "Hold on." Tesh had been in the process of unbuckling his sword belt. "Stopped. You aren't planning on going there, are you?" "You can't," Ryam said. "Even painted in or in for it's too dangerous. The Merilith keep a constant vigil." Anwar explained. The Galantian pulled a cup of water from the barrel and drank. "He's right," Tesh added. "They have them stationed all along the far bank. They watch our side. It's a game with them." "A game?" she asked. "Yeah." Tesh dropped the last of his gear, then threw himself down on the dirt, propping his head up with a sack of apples. A wild orchard wasn't too far to the south, and because it was autumn, they had a lot of fruit drinks, and Plenary had been trying to make hard cider so far without luck. "I suppose it's like fishing for them. Since destroying the bridge, they try to hook us. They lure us into just the right spot, then a tree topples, or the river washes away a bank and sends someone over the falls. Persephone wouldn't want you getting anywhere near that tower." "Yes, she does. She's the one who sent me. Why? I'm going to talk to the Frey and end this war." "You can't be serious." Tess looked incredulously at everyone around and let out a little laugh. "You go near that tower, and they'll kill you. It's okay." Suri smiled at him. Then she looked eastward again. "I was invited." Chapter 12. Avampartha. Everything is so obvious. When you look back, it is the first time through the garden of fear and doubt that messes with your head. The Book of Bryn. The canopy hid most of the stars, except along the scar of the road. The chalk-white gravel illuminated by the sliver of pale light looked eerie in the dark, a magic path into the unknown that both reassured and terrified Suri saw. The gleaming trail as a sign from Wogan that she was heading in the right direction, but that did nothing to eliminate the fear of where that road would lead. Suri had few illusions about her future, except that the path before her was necessary. She always knew becoming a butterfly would come at a cost, but never dreamed there would be so many payments. Suri had left Tesh and his men at the cluster of tents. They had wanted to escort her, or so they said. She didn't need the art to sense their relief. When she explained that she had to go alone, Suri slowed her pace as the road entered a clearing, and it was there that she first spotted a Venpather. She'd expected a dark, frightening silhouette marring a star-filled sky. What Suri saw took her breath. With its beauty in the middle of the pale river rose a shimmering pinnacle of wonder. Suri saw a lady dressed in a gown of silver light swirling on the edge of the world. Her arms were thrust skyward in jubilation as she danced and kicked up a mist rising in the center of the Nidwalden on the brink of the falls. Avampartha was no less than the embodiment of joy captured in glimmering stone. Enraptured, Suri hardly noticed that while she continued to walk, the constant crunch and crackle of her feet on gravel had long since stopped. She was on the bedrock that reached right to the water's edge, and from there she saw balconies, lighted windows, doorways, and stairs dotting the surface of Avampatra. This was nothing like any building she had ever seen. This wasn't brutally set upon the land or hacked from stone, and it certainly wasn't assembled from the carcasses of trees. The tower hadn't been forced into existence. It had been invited, born into the world. It belonged to a land just as much as the rivers, mountains, or forests. She felt joined to the tower as they stood across from each other, Suri gazing at the tower, and the tower looking back. At least someone was watching her. Suri sensed eyes. "Are you Montaigne?" Someone else? She couldn't tell. The art was rarely so specific. All those odd sensations of dread, without cause, a general suspicion, were not to stay in bed on a given day, or the knowledge that choosing this was better than choosing that. These were the hallmarks of the art. This ability to hear the voice of Elin wasn't limited to artists. Everyone heard her, but artists were trained to listen. Suri stood there waiting. That was the scary part. Unlike everyone else who came near a Venpather, she didn't wear Orenfar runes. Wearing them would block her ability to use the art, which would defeat much of her purpose for the trip. Arian's words to Persephone wafted back to sorcery like the scent of lilac on a warm summer's day. My people think wounds are animals, mindless beasts. They feel no guilt about killing your kind, just like you don't consider it wrong to kill a deer. I know, I thought the same way before I met you. We need to prove to my Fane, to all the Frey, that you are worthy of life and deserve respect, dignity, and sovereignty. If they can see we are more similar then they think they'll understand their mistake. Suri was confident about defending herself against the art one-on-one at least, but she wasn't so certain how she'd fare against the power of a Venpather, which was filled with who knew how many Marilith. She was well within range of any assault they might wish to conjure, but she hadn't even bothered with a shield. She wasn't there to fight. Gripping Tora's staff tightly, she waited to see if the ruler of the tower would attack. Nothing happened. This was both good and bad, so he liked not being exploded or struck by lightning. But now what? Suri tapped the ground with her staff, slid her lips left then right, took a breath and sidled out. Hello, she called. But the roar of the falls swallowed her tiny voice. They knew she was there, understood she was waiting from inside the tower. Suri felt a giant eye glaring at her. Minutes went by, and still there was no reaction. Suri sat down on the stone, put the staff across her lap and legs dangling off the edge. She sawed them back and forth, fishing an apple out of her bag. She ate it, then flung the core at the tower. Suri had a good arm, but the remains of the fruit didn't even reach halfway before disappearing into the mist. This is just plain brute. Suri stood again. She walked away from the river and climbed up a bald-faced escarpment. There she opened her arms and hummed. Suri liked to start weaves that way. She didn't need to anymore, but it did balance her, and a little counterweight helped, because the power from the falls, while not being channeled into her the way it would if she had been standing inside the tower, still delivered quite a kick. She rapped her staff on the stone, and it replied, drawing from deep underground. She compressed it, thinning the rock much in the way Clifford made pots rise from his spinning wheel by squeezing clay between his fingers. Suri directed the stony cliff to reach out toward the tower. She began walking even before the stone completed its journey. As she did, she widened her bridge, because erratic gusts of wind pummeled her, and the mist made the stone's surface slick. How stupid would it be to fall right now? The all-powerful Rune Marilith is coming, and whoops, there she goes. Sensing a weakness in the stone, Suri drew up a support pillar from the bottom of the river. After securing her walkway, she gave a glance to the tower. Nothing had changed. She hoped the art might grant her a warning if the defenders decided to blast her with a torrent of water or a cyclone of wind. As it was, the night was devoid of both dread and welcome. Halfway across, Suri looked down at the raging river, hearing the roar as water flew over the edge. She sensed a reluctance that bordered on terror. Suri hadn't given much thought to how drops felt when plummeting off a cliff. She figured any fear of heights would have been conquered after falling as rain, but perhaps that was like being born. No one remembered their beginnings. Suri sympathized with the droplet's plight. As a youth, she had raced across fallen logs, slick with dew, and leapt chasms without a moment's hesitation. She and Mina had been fearless. Truth be told, Mina, being the wisest of wolves, was often reluctant to follow, but eventually came along. Nowadays, Sora had lost some of her unbridled audacity. Where and when it went wasn't known. Time had sneaked in and stolen her recklessness. This realization was exceedingly apparent as she walked the narrow stone pathway. Suri wasn't scared, merely apprehensive, with a dash of concern added in for good measure. These trepidations gave her pause, and while she didn't drag her feet or crawl, Suri wasn't comfortable with the idea of running. Mina would have approved, which caused Suri to suspect that while age had stolen some of her courage, it had left the gift of wisdom. Suri aimed for the broad balcony in front of her, the one with a large set of double doors. The sides of it had railings, but the front had been left open, as if it was an official dock. Drawing stone from the tower was easier than from the shore. The moment she switched sides, Suri noticed the ease with which the rock extended, as if that stone was experienced at being used for exactly this purpose. When the two sides of the bridge met, Suri paused, ready to cringe. When she wasn't struck dead, she shrugged and walked the remaining distance. Stepping onto the balcony, she felt an odd sense of relief, especially given she was now squarely in the jaws of her enemy. The roar of the falls was muffled by the building's platform and the wind cut by the tower. This left the little space before the big doors oddly quiet. Taking but 3 steps forward, she felt an eruption of power so strong it made her dizzy. A loud cracking erupted behind her. The blue tower's stone returned to whence it came, and the rest of Sora's narrow bridge collapsed and sank. Welcome to Evan Parada, a voice said in Frey, whirling around, which only compounded her vertigo. Suri saw that the big doors had opened, light poured forth, and the silhouettes of several robe-clad Frey Approached her in the lead was an elderly individual with a long white beard and a wreath of thinning hair. The beard, hair, and wrinkles made him appear far more ruin-like than Frey. "I'm Gerald." He looked at her with a quizzical sidelong stare. "Do you speak?" "Frey, I do indeed," she said formally, even adding a bit of an Estramadian accent. Years ago, Orion had explained how Frey from various regions spoke differently. Those from the capital city had a conservative style and a tendency to replace the with a terse sound, a trait that Sori knew Gifford would hate. Orion also indicated that the Frey were acutely aware of dialect distinctions, as she had put it. The Estramadian phrasing, which was far more formal than how the Astarias spoke, was more respected. She went with that because it's how Orion had talked. "I am sorry," Jared smiled, revealing a host of previously hidden wrinkles that rose beneath his eyes. "We've been expecting you." She gave a second glance at the lack of bridge behind her. Jared frowned. An apology. "Security is a high priority, what with the war and all. I'm sure you understand." As the wind buffeted his hair in a most disrespectful manner, he turned sideways and extended a hand toward the open door. "Please come in, won't you?" For an instant, Suri sensed a whisper of dread, the same sort that warned of approaching bad weather or the onset of a nasty cold. It could have been anything, but she was pretty sure she wasn't detecting a storm or a sniffles. "I am in the middle of the lake already. The far shore is just as close as swimming back." Suri pushed away her trepidations and advanced toward the ranks of Frey. They all wore similar dark robes, some with raised hoods. Those that didn't displayed bald heads. Each stared at her, but none spoke. The idea of walking that gauntlet toward that interior space made Suri's stomach crawl into her throat. She hated being indoors, loathed the idea of being trapped inside walls. Even ones as beautiful as Avampath's Tura had always warned against spending too much time inside. Makes a body crazy living beneath a roof that ain't the sky, on a floor that isn't dirt, and between walls made to keep things out, but actually trap what's in. We ain't supposed to live inside a box any more than we're supposed to live neath the surface of a pond. Can't breathe and without air. Well, you know, the dread sidled a few steps closer to doom as Suri neared the great doors. "What if once I go in I can't get out?" Suri was desperately afraid of being trapped in a small space, or worst of all, buried alive. She learned the phobia from Tora, who was so horrified by the prospect that she insisted Suri burn her body rather than bury it flying skyward with the sparks. An ash had to be better than being sealed underground. Gripping Tora's staff with white knuckles, Suri forced herself to walk through the entrance. The moment she did, the sense of dread vanished. The interior of the tower was nothing like she'd expected. Not a torch or lantern burned, but Suri had no trouble seeing the walls themselves gave off a soft blue light. Vaulted ceilings, 100 feet high, spread out like a forest canopy with intricately lined designs that suggested ivy and leaves. The glossy floor reminded her of a still lake. Railings looked like the curling tendrils of creeping vines. Nothing was without adornment, every inch imbued with beauty, and Kara music filled the place, giving it life. The muted humming of the falls created a low, comforting sound, while wind brushing the tower's curves created soft, reassuring tones. Wind in leaves inside fountains added to this music with bubbling and trickling. These were the melodies of a forest. The voices of home-living birds flew up in the high places and sang songs of summer, lazy days, and flowered fields. They ate from feeders, bathed in fountains, and slept in nests of cloth and string. Jared led her up several sets of stairs, through great rooms, and across interior bridges that spanned between spire shafts. All the while he watched her, and not only with his eyes, she felt the deft touch of the art, probing and investigating. At last they reached a small room where he offered her a seat. This chamber wasn't as nice as some of the others, just 2 chairs and a little table filled the space, but there was a window that looked out on stars. After taking a moment to slip off his cloak, he sat. Suri did the same, removing her old traveling cape and setting it on the back of the chair. A few of those who had walked with them began to whisper excitedly, until Jared asked them to leave with a stern look and a sharp wave. "Please forgive them," Jared said with a dismayed tone. "Most have never seen a rune up close, much less one wearing an askar. I take no offense at that, but I'm curious, why didn't you extend a bridge for me?" "That wasn't very polite." Jared looked surprised by the question. "I was told to expect a well-educated practitioner of the art, someone who would need no assistance crossing the river." Suri still found it rude but because Jared bore no resemblance to the horror that was Grindel, and he seemed more like an old ruin than a Frey. She began to relax. A porcelain teapot rested on the table, steam escaping its neck. Jared filled 2 small white cups. "Do you have tea in?" Roland Surrey nodded, then realized that a mute response might appear less intelligent, so she added several types for enjoyment and medicinal purposes. She had taken a chance using the word medicinal. Orion had used it a few times, and Surrey always thought it sounded smart, but she couldn't be positive she'd used it correctly. Jared's face betrayed no hint of an error, and Surrey guessed she'd locked out. "Orion was never fond of our willow bark tea." At the mention of the name, Jared perked up. "I was told you were a student of hers. Is that correct?" Again, Surrey nodded and silently chided herself for it. She needed to talk to prove Rune were civilized thinking people. "Orion helped me," she almost said become a butterfly, but changed it at the last second and finished with "learn the art, and you believe yourself to be a Merilith." Surrey didn't need the art to know this was a trap. "No, Merilith is a Frey tribe. I'm human." She emphasized the last word. "I can never be a Merilith." Surrey expected an impressed nod, as she was certain that had sounded smart, but Jared appeared unimpressed. "Then what were you?" This dumped her butterfly wasn't going to cut it with this old Frey, even though in her own mind that's how she saw herself. She considered all the names others had called her: Rune, Merilith, witch, sorcerer, magician, spellweaver. None of them fit, and they all had negative connotations. In addition, they were runic words which would mean nothing to him. She needed something enlightened, something frayed, something like. She smiled. "I am a censurer." Jared looked puzzled. No, it was more than that. He seemed concerned. "Do you know what Sensla means? It'd be ironic if I didn't." Surrey ventured a friendly smile. "Swift of mind. It's the nickname given to Orion by Fane Funelay." They both sipped tea, which was different from what Surrey was used to, more fragrant, as if brewed from flowers. Jared clutched the cup to his chest with both hands. His left had a slight quiver, which the right helped to steady. She didn't sense he was frightened. The more probable explanation was that age had weakened him. And yet, isn't it possible he's putting on a thick mask just like me? The Frey had lost almost every major engagement of the war, the exception being the first battle of the hardwood pushed back to the tower. They were on the brink of destruction. Surrey had been a big part of their early victories. She had made the Gillarabran that had turned their fortunes at the Battle of Granford, and while Jared may indeed have forced her to extend a bridge to the tower as a means of identification, it was also a test. He didn't know she had refused to build a bridge for Nephrin and his troops. But how could he not be worried about her doing so in the future? Was it so outlandish to believe he could be frightened? He certainly had more at stake than she did. She'd gambled her life, but if peace couldn't be reached, it could mean the destruction of his entire civilization. She wanted to calm his fears, so she said, "I've been sent to discuss ending this war. Nephrin has given you the authority to negotiate Persephone, as she is the leader of my people, not Nephrin. He is her husband." Jared's eyes widened at that, and while previously the art had detected only dead air between them, she received a sudden burst of shock, topped with an aftertaste of revulsion. All of it was quickly erased, not wanting to appear too passive or submissive. Surrey asserted herself. "And are you able to speak for your Fane?" "Actually, no. I was merely instructed to verify you existed. Now that we've literally crossed that bridge, I report my findings and receive additional instructions." "But well," Jared set down his cup and stood. "It's late, and I'm certain you had a tiring trip. I've been rude in not offering you food and rest. You are our most distinguished guest, and nothing will be spared for your comfort. I will order a chamber prepared food brought, and tomorrow we'll know more about how to proceed. Would you care for a bath?" Surrey didn't know how to answer that. She loathed baths, never understood why Arian loved them, so the whole idea was preposterous. No one could avoid dirt, and why would anyone care about having some? It wasn't cold like snow or hot like, well, a bath. And how was covering oneself in water better than being covered in dirt? Still, Arian took a bath every chance she got, concerned that she would be perceived as less cultured by refusing. She said, "Of course the road was very dirty." Jared smiled in understanding. "Absolutely. I'll see it's taken care of now, if you'll excuse me." With that, he stepped out, leaving Surrey alone with her fragrant tea. Surrey couldn't sleep. She'd always had trouble doing so indoors, too quiet, and there was no other way to describe it. To dead life was lived under stars and clouds, surrounded by living trees and blades of grass nodding off in any room, even one That was no doubt the best, and Avampatha proved to be too difficult. As a result, she was awake to see the Tower of Avampatha change colors. With the morning light, the glow shifted steadily from blue to a warm golden hue. As far as rooms went, this was the most beautiful one Sori had ever been in. And yet there was a closed door. Thankfully, it wasn't bolted. She checked that almost as soon as Jared had left, and continued to verify the fact throughout the night. If the door had been barred, Suri would have added a large hole in the wall. Whether the Frey liked it or not, she'd make it a big opening leading to a broad balcony. With the amount of power Avanatha was feeding her, she felt confident she could have built a city. That was another thing keeping her up. She practically vibrated with raw energy. Suri felt buoyed, almost euphoric. The channeled strength of the falls was a temptation, begging her to try it out, put it to a test. And yet that massive flow wasn't the most power she'd ever felt, not even close. They came to her shortly after sunrise. Jared, who smiled broadly, and his flock of Baldmer leaves, who watched her with suspicious eyes, had entered. After a polite knock, one of the group carried a small wooden box. Gift slept well, I hope? Jared asked. Sarongli smiled back. I've received instructions and have made arrangements for your transportation. Transpiration. Suri didn't know what that meant, and it pained her to show ignorance. How stupid must I look right now? Ah yes, Jared bit his lip. He's surprised. I don't understand. I was doing so well, and now for a person of your importance, I've secured a carry. Suri winced at yet another unfamiliar word this time. Jared appeared to understand and added, carriages. Well, you have them. It's a box on wheels that is pulled by horses. Oh, you mean a wagon? Jarrett smiled, but didn't nod, which made her think he had no idea what the word wagon meant. How do you like it? That's not necessary. I don't mind walking. I'd actually prefer that. This is better. The journey is quite long. He smiled again. Where am I going to? Strumden. It's our capital, and we want you to be comfortable. I thought we were going to be discussing matters here. Jared smiled once more, and there was something in that expression she didn't like. The Fane wishes to conduct negotiations with you personally. Arun, who can wield the art, is an incredible thing. He feels it's important that our people meet you. Most Frey have never encountered Arun, and their impressions, I'm sorry to say, aren't very enlightened. Seeing you and hearing how eloquently you speak our language will make it easier for the Fane. The peace process will be accepted as an agreement between equals, without that the people would think him weak and wouldn't understand how he could give concessions to a people that are thought to be so inferior. I'm not likely to make the Fane. Am I sorry? His words came to her from the past. She'd been arguing with Orion about the woman's plan to stop the war. At the time, Suri wasn't a real artist. Orion was considered an outlaw, and she didn't know anyone else who could arrange an audience. Since then, everything had changed. Jared's argument made sense, and Suri knew that meeting the Fame face to face had always been Arian's wish. All right, she agreed. I'll go. Wonderful. Jared looked over at the box. There is one small matter that we need to address. For that to happen, the Merilith, holding it, stepped forward and pulled back the lid. Inside was a circular metal band. Suri recognized the same sort of collar that Malcolm had worn, and just like the ex-slaves, this one had a small but formidable-looking device that would keep it closed before she could say anything, and she had quite a bit to say. Jared spoke up. A personal audience requires this. It has long been the policy of the Fane of any great ruler. I suspect that no one enters their presence armed with weapons. I hope you can understand that it would be insane to allow you, an enemy combatant and powerful artist, to have a private audience with our leader. We won't even allow our own people to approach him when armed, and Frey don't kill Frey. We certainly can't allow you to walk into his chambers with all the power of the art. It was then that Suri noticed that the inside of the collar was engraved with markings. She knew them well, having once painted the same symbols on a set of bandages for Orion Dorinfa. She said this time. Jared nodded. You must surrender your weapon before I can allow you to proceed. Suri stared at the collar. Stephanie hadn't said anything about this. Did she know? Suri didn't think so. I realize this is unpleasant, Jared said. I certainly wouldn't want it on one of these, but look at it from our point of view. There's no way for us to be sure that you're not going to assassinate our leader, as powerful as you are. It would be beyond foolish for us to let you cross the river, much less get near our Fane. Suri didn't take her eyes off the circlet. She remembered the difficulty Rain had getting Malcolm's off. She also recalled how much Orion had complained when cut off from the art. "Let me ask you this," Jared said. "Would you allow our best warrior to bring his extremely sharp sword when visiting your leader? Would you take that chance?" With what did you say her name was? Persephone. Suri tried to imagine if the situations were reversed, making it difficult to ignore Jared's point. "And yet, can't I just speak to you and then have you talk to the Fane? It will take longer." But that wouldn't solve the issue of having others in Estramaden meet you. There are members of his council, leaders of each tribe, who may not understand him. Giving in to what they see as a barbaric race, he shook his head. "No, I'm afraid that the only chance for this to work is for you to go to Estramaden. And to do that, we must ensure you can't obliterate it." Suri thought about the destruction of Neath and wondered if he had heard about it. Regardless, he made a valid point. Her trepidation must have showed, because he reached out and closed the lid. "Never mind, I can see you're uncomfortable." He waved to the one holding the box. "Take it away and extend a bridge for her to the west bank of the river." He then turned his attention back to Suri. "I'm sorry we couldn't work this out, but I do thank you for coming, Suri, and trying to end this awful war." Arian's words emerged from the past. "One day, when both sides have drunk their fill of blood, the truth about you could provide the honorable excuse to end it. It's just so horrible to think so many people need to die to reveal wisdom that ought to be common sense." "Wait," Suri said, stopping the flock and the box from leaving. "If they wanted me dead, they would have killed me before I even crossed the river. If I put this on, I'll be given safe passage to the Fane and back again." "Absolutely," Jared replied, "but I don't want you doing anything that you aren't sure about." Suri probed as best she could, but the art offered no hint, no suggestion about his intent. "What value is there in men's rafts and Arian's deaths if I walk away now? And how can I deny this is the path Malcolm wanted me to follow? What good is a butterfly that's too afraid to flutter?" Suri nodded. "If it can bring peace, I accept." When the lock clicked into place, Jared felt a wave of relief pass over him. "It's over." She's ours. A moment before he'd felt the power radiating off her like the heat of a massive bonfire. The rune's strength had been stunning, and it was little wonder she'd nearly killed Mondelez and was capable of conjuring dragons. But with the collar on, the fire had gone out. The woman who called herself Sensler was now just a ruin, and Jared knew how to deal with their kind. "Look at it," he said to the others with a sneer. "The traitor dressed it up, taught it to speak and use the art, but she's no better than any other ruin now." Lafayette was right to neutralize her threat, and his plans for her will certainly end this war, not through a negotiated peace, but by the annihilation of the entire barbaric horde who dared to wage war against us. The room backed up and brandished the stick she'd brought. The moment Oceal tried to grab her, she struck him across the side of his head. "You lied," she shouted. Jared waved a hand, and the staff was ripped from her fingers and thrown across the room. But that was all he could do. The collar prevented the rune from using the art, but it also prevented Jared and the other mirror leaf from silencing or controlling her. She'd have to be subdued by physical force. She was quick but outnumbered, and they pushed her back into a corner of the room. Kicking and clawing, they finally restrained her with thick leather straps. Then 4 of them lifted and carried her out. Jared called after them, "Lock her up." Chapter 13. "My prince, I have always thought children are universally loved, but I find it hard to believe that even a mother could love the likes of Granbach and Mondelet." The Book of Blin Mondelet watched with indignation as Traeger assembled the Tower of Twigs. With amused bewilderment, he saw her gather brown pine needles, dead leaves, and a massive wad of withered blonde grass from her pack. She pulled out a bark-stripped stick as thick as his thumb and a little bow that she bent against the ground so that the string could be pulled taut. Then she retrieved a knife and a foot-long board and began cutting a depression in it. Amazingly, there were 3 other cavities, all scorched. "She's done this before." The thought was mind-boggling. Montoliu stretched his legs across the dirt and stole one of Trower's 3 traveling bags, the soft one with bedding. He propped it behind his head to watch. Frogs peeped in the darkness of the forest. Crickets added to the general noise of the woodland. No fireflies, Wonderlay noted till late in the year, he guessed with a vague disappointment. Chilled, he pulled his cloak and elbows tighter. but did nothing to interfere with Trower. A night on the road was devoid of good entertainment, placing one end of the stripped stick into the little divot she just dug out of the face of the board. Trier wrapped the bowstring around the spindle and began sewing back and forth, spinning the vertical stick. She applied pressure on the butt end of the spindle with a block of stone and continued to drill the little depression. Wider smoke emerged. After only a few seconds, Trier stopped her drilling, which confused Mondelez, since she had just started making some real progress. Maybe her arm is tired. She didn't look fatigued or frustrated. Traeger moved methodically and confidently as she began using her ever-present knife to cut a notch from the side of the board to the hole. She just drilled each of the little scorched divots had similar notches with a cut. Tree abandoned the board to search through her previously gathered pile of odds and ends, picking out a leaf with curled sides. She set it on a large piece of bark, then positioned the hearthboard above it so that the leaf was beneath the notch. With a knife she roughed up the spindle's end and then got back to sawing. When the smoke appeared for the second time, she really laid into it such that he could hear the string sing and the wood cry. Montaigne watched closely, but still no flame or fire. Once more Treya stopped. Something's wrong. Wood to wet. Maybe. Treya didn't appear disheartened in the slightest, nor did she look surprised. She pulled the board away. A bit of smoking wood dust, which had been ground out of the hole, remained on the leaf. This she gingerly lifted and deposited on her wadded nest of dead grass. Then, lifting it close to her face, she began to blow. As she did, the nest smoked only a bit at first, but after several puffs the grass was hidden in a thick cloud. She set the whole thing down near her tower of twigs and continued to wheeze on it until finally a tiny flame appeared. Treya looked up, saw him watching, and offered a self-satisfied grin. "Do you seriously go through all that for every meal or cup of tea?" Wandela asked. "Of course, my lord." Trier carefully placed her twigs over the infant flame, feeding it like a baby bird while repeatedly looking over at him with that stupid grin. Wandley couldn't take it anymore. Pushing to his feet, he walked over and stomped the fire out, kicking the whole mess aside. Treyer scrambled away, staring up at him with shock. "You're pathetic," he told her. "You know that, don't you?" He clapped his hands, and 3 massive logs rolled out of the nearby trees. They huddled together. For once, the carefully built tower of twigs had stood. Mondelez rubbed his palms together, hummed a tune, then squeezed a fist. The logs burst into a bonfire that illuminated the woodland clearing. The two had settled in that. "Trower," he pointed, "is a fire." "Ah yes, my lord, of course, my apologies." Trower had drawn away from both him and the fire that blackened the ground around it. "I'm genuinely horrified to think what else you do on a day-to-day basis. Do you fetch water from the river in buckets, use needle and thread to sew my clothes?" He lifted the edge of his cloak to peer at his assig, as if it had offended him. "It's like I'm living with a run for Farrell's sake. Do you howl at the moon and worship the sun like they do?" "Of course not." Trier rocked up on her knees. Insulting her faith had started another very different fire. She glared at him, at her prince, with defiance unbecoming a servant. Her jaw was set, her little hands made into fists. "Therol is the only god I recognize. She is the only true." Mondelez stopped her. Thrown off balance by the one-word question, Treyer looked puzzled. Yes, my lord." "You think Firel is female?" She nodded. Montaigne wasn't an expert on religion. He went to the ceremonies in midwinter and midsummer like everyone else, but rarely listened to Volheric's sermons. The sound of his voice always made Montaigne drowsy. The best religious education Mondelaire had received had come from Grindel, which preached that the Merilith were gods, a belief that was undergoing a crisis of faith as of late. But Grindel had always spoke of Firel as male, and Volheric himself had referred to his law and his blessings. But the Amonse Montaleg began, but he stopped when Treya frowned and turned away. "You don't accept the word of the priest?" "Not my place to speak ill about such esteemed fray." Treya began gathering up her fire-making tools and stuffed them back into her bag. "So what makes you think Firel is female? Is it just wishful thinking, based on your own gender?" Again he got a nasty look, the same one he'd seen his entire life. Usually, it was accompanied by the words, "my prince." Normally she referred to him as my lord or simply sir. But if he tracked mud through the palace, was late getting up for one of his father's meetings, or killed his goldfish out of neglect, she addressed him that way and gave him the look. Those 2 words, said in her condemning accusatory tone, had sent chills down his back like nothing else, a leftover irritation from his childhood truer. Had been Wandela's servant for as long as he could remember, it was possible she might even have been his wet nurse, although he tried not to think about that. Such thoughts made him nauseous. But it wasn't because he hated her. Wandela hardly thought of her at all. But he had recently realized she was perhaps the only person in the world he could tolerate for any extended period of time. She was always around, and had always been that way. Traeger was as comfortable as a well-worn shoe, and she might be the only one who truly loved him. A look is not an answer, he reprimanded. I'm asking a legitimate question. My grandmother told me. Trey had surrendered her glare and finished putting her notched board and spindle away along with the stone she'd cupped in her palm. While drilling, he was amused that she packed it as if the forest weren't filled with thousands of ones just like it. I thought your family was quite dry. She jerked the bag strings, closing it, and gave him only a smirk. This time McGuire can't know something about Feral that the Unilan do not. Yeah, isn't that why we have that tribe next? You'll be saying you can build houses better than the Elven. Or he shook his head. No, I think it's obvious you can't make a fire better than a Merlith. You shouldn't be so certain of everything. My Prince. Wonderlay cringed. Why doesn't she just scrape her teeth across a fork? It'd produce the same result. Pride is she stopped, the smirk replaced by a look of pity. She bit her lip, turned away, and went to retrieve a different bag, the one that rattled. Montague had heard that bag's contents clattering against Treya's back the whole day. He didn't know what was in it, but he knew it annoyed him. Opening the sack, she pulled out pots and pans. Before I offend you further, my lord, I'll need water with your permission. Wonderlay frowned and held up a hand, stopping her. The trail they'd been walking followed a pleasant stream that made a faint rushing sound. Even if Montaigne couldn't see or hear it, he'd have known the stream was there the same way a person would realize a lit candle was in a dark room. The power of that stream was what he'd used to create the fire, which he found humorous in a way only a mere Leith would. Wandela lifted 3 bowls of water from the river, just as he'd done when going to the Orenthian as a junior counselor for the first time. On that other occasion, Vidar had chastised him. This time, Traeger merely watched in awe as the gelatinous-looking globes wobbled over and collapsed into the pots. If you heat the water, Trey said, we won't even need the fire, except perhaps to keep bears away. Although I suppose you can do that too, couldn't you? She pulled assorted vegetables from the bag and began cutting them with a knife. I suppose you could build us a whole house if needed, isn't that right? Her tone was far less than admiring, but far short of sarcastic. What were you going to say? Montaigne asked. Treya gave him an ignorant, innocent look. You started to say something about pride. Oh, did I? I don't remember. That's the worst lie I've ever heard. She's not even trying. Wonderlick thought, then reconsidered. No, she doesn't know how to lie. When has she ever had a need? Do you think you'll have any trouble bringing the rune back to Estermaden? Freya changed the subject up. Until that moment he didn't think she knew where they were going, let alone why she hadn't asked. But apparently Trey knew more than she'd let on. Servants did that. The practice came from listening in the shadows, and it made him wonder who her grandmother had been eavesdropping on when she heard Firo was female, and where was it she'd learned about pride? Treya wouldn't tell him about either. Not now. Servants were like mice. If you caught them off guard, you had a chance, but once spooked they ran, and there was no catching them. No. Wonderlay answered and lay down again, hooking his hands behind his head. The hardest part will be dealing with the horse pulling the cage. I don't like horses. She is in a cage. That's what you do with dangerous animals. Trier looked west through the trees. How can a run be dangerous? He knew what she was thinking. If he could protect them from bears, what problem could a run be? But Montalek could still remember running for his life while descending the rocky bluff across from Ellenrist. As he ran, Jarrett had said, talent is one thing, a knack is another. But a moment ago, we were nearly hit by enough raw power to make me think Avanpartha has a twin. He still didn't know how it was possible. Neither did Jarrett. If Monty had been an instant slower, he would have died. Monty had only been 26 at the time. How insane is it that I almost perished so soon after being born? There are so many awful dusty relics staggering around the face of a land for thousands of years, and I was nearly snuffed out at a quarter century. The thought still rattled him, even with the collar and cage. Wonderla wasn't at all eager to meet her again. But Jared couldn't afford to spare even one Merilith from his defense of the river, and Wonderla was available. Furthermore, he was familiar with this ruin. They had a history, and Mondelez not likely to underestimate her again. Wanderley forced to smile. Any wild animal can be dangerous, but there's no need to worry as long as I'm with you. I'm a Merilith, and it's just a wound. Chapter 14. Down by the river bank, they say seeing is believing, but people often see what they want rather than what is, which makes me wonder about the virtues of blindness. The book of Bryn. Suri shivered in the cold of the little room. They'd taken her askar and cloak, leaving her exposed in only her thin linen shift. Hugging her legs to her chest, she balled herself up in a corner of the vacant cell. But the cold wasn't the biggest problem. Sari couldn't breathe. The cell had no window, and whenever she tried to hammer on the sealed door, the answer was always the same. Back, an angry voice would shout, "I have to get out, I have to get out." The 5 words screamed in her head, sometimes in runic, other times in Frey, sometimes in both. As she exchanged various words, without reason, her heart fluttered as fast as a hummingbird's wings, and every muscle in her body was clenched so tightly they hurt. And that wasn't all. "I have to get out, I have to get out." She had lots of pains. Her arms and hands hurt the worst because of beating on the door. She'd also thrown her body against it, even against the stone walls, screaming all the while. She'd seriously injured her shoulder and banged her head so hard she saw stars. The pain had actually helped. The physical agony superseded the panic, at least for a while. Suri had never felt panic before, but she'd known dread and fear. They were old pals in comparison. But the exposed nerve horror she'd experienced since the door closed was new and excruciating. For several hours she stopped being herself. Who she had turned into, she had no idea. The one thing that saved her was that most of that time was thankfully obliterated from her memory by a sensation. She was outside, looking back at herself. "That can't be me," she thought. "If it is, I've gone mad." She remembered hearing laughter, lots of laughter. "Vicious little thing, look how ugly it is. It's throwing itself against the door again. Should we do something? It's going to kill itself. Look, it's bleeding. That's strange. Its blood is red. Would have thought it would be green or maybe black." Eventually the voices stopped, and in the silence Suri's body ran out of strength. Battered, bruised, and bloody, she collapsed, curled in a tight ball. All she could do was whimper and moan. The room was lined with straw, and even though she gathered what she could, it was little defense against the ever-present chill. A once inviting tower had become a terror. "I have to get out, I have to get out." She squeezed her fists and eyes shut and clenched her teeth. She tried to hum, tried to summon the support of the world through the art, but that had been stripped away. She was alone, isolated, abandoned, and utterly lost. Whether days or hours passed, Suri couldn't tell. There was nothing but the cold and the 5 words repeating over and over in a loop, and then the cycle was broken when someone asked, "Can you hear me?" She didn't answer, couldn't. If she wanted to. "Mandalay is coming to get you. He's on his way. Do you know who that is? Do you know what that means?" She heard a tapping on the door and heavy, raspy breathing. "Have you been enjoying your stay? Rin to bad. There haven't been any more baths." This was followed by laughter. Then even that sound faded. As it did, Sari realized she'd stopped hearing. "I have to get out." A new, more terrible phrase began to repeat in her head. "Mandalay is coming to get you." Avampartha. Over the last 3 years, the tower had become more popular than the Tetlin, which, when cursing like everyone born of a human mother, Tesh hated it, but couldn't help marveling at the sight rising out of the mist. The tower looked to have been created when a giant piece of sky fell with great force, and the resulting splash turned solid at its apex. Everyone knew it was made of stone, but at that distance and shining in the morning sun, Tesh could have sworn the glinting blue tower was made of ice, jagged and sharp. He'd seen the tower many times, its ghostly apparition always partially hidden behind pale mist. Thrown by the falls was the most notable landmark along the bank, and utterly impossible to mistake for anything else. The tower was the final goal, the treasure forever out of reach. Being the elves' only remaining frontier defense of Enbather was the last obstacle, and it had been that way for 3 years. "Well?" Tesh asked as Anwer stood on the rocky shore. The Galantian was looking across the river with an expression that might have been considered sad if Tesh had been more sympathetic to him or his kind. On that far shore lay the elven realm, Anwer's homeland. He was barred from setting foot on that bank Just as much as any ruin, the Frey looked down near his feet, then up the bank. He sighed while shaking his head. It just stops. That's not possible. Are you saying they swam across? I'm telling you the trail ends here. Tesh looked at the fast-flowing water. He tossed a twig in the river and watched as it was swept over the falls. They couldn't swim it. Tesh. Brigham interrupted. Shouldn't we see about burying Meeks? Tesh shook his head and gestured up the tower. I want to escort her back out through the forest. It's been 3 days, so she ought to be coming out soon, right? Let's give it another few more days. Besides this, maybe our best chance to discover how the elves have been crossing the night. Suri had approached the tower. All of Tesh's men had feared the mystic was committing suicide. Watching from a safe distance in far armor, they had watched her create a bridge, cross over and enter. To their great surprise, there was no lightning, fire, or explosions. Looks like she was right about being invited. Tess had thought if peace talks were actually underway, and it certainly seemed like that was the case. This gave Tess an exceptional opportunity to search the river bank. He theorized that the elves wouldn't do anything to jeopardize the negotiations, so they'd spent the next 3 days searching for the secret to how their enemies had been getting back across the Nidweilen. They'd found some fresh tracks near the site of Neffen's destroyed bridge, but the mystery remained unsolved. Even when not turned into a weapon used to destroy the Durg's bridge, the current of the river made crossing impossible. And yet somehow the elves were doing it with amazing regularity. At first Tesh suspected the Miralith were extending bridges at night, as they had at Allen Rised, but centuries had proven that theory wrong and were continued to search. But Tesh wondered if his heart was in the work as the Frey fidgeted with a knotted bit of rawhide. Nephrin was fixated on crossing, frantic to obliterate the tower and crush the Fane. But Anwar wasn't like him. Tesh had hoped to uncover the secret that had vexed them for years, but it was becoming clear that wasn't going to happen. On the other hand, apparently he was right about the truth, because the Merilith had been ignoring them. Hey, look at that, Edgar said, pointing across the water. A span had extended to the eastern bank, but that wasn't unusual. The elves made bridges on that side all the time. Wagons of supplies were always being delivered. The Merilith made the bridges in minutes, but the great and glorious Nephrin couldn't build one on their side despite 5 full years of trying. What's of it? Atkins asked. There's a wagon setting out, but it's odd, ain't got no sides. Well, I guess it does, sort of. And we appeared across the river bars. He told them it's an animal cage, but that one is on wheels. Tesh squinted, but couldn't make out much. A cage on wheels. Unwar nodded, then went back to his knotting, this time using his hair. How he managed it. Tesh never learned. Knots in his own hair usually fell out, but the phrase somehow got them to stay. Big cage. Tesh stood up to get a better look. Probably for sheep, Brigham said. Back in Ren we had pens to separate out the rams from the ewes. I thought you Killians raised wheat to barley, something like that, Edkin said. Did Brigham replied. I didn't mean we as in my family, I meant the doll in general. Me and my brothers helped out Gelston and Delwyn. What for? Edgar asked. What do they give you for helping? Wasn't like that. Brigham shook his head, then shrugged. Everyone pitched in. We're needed in the doll. That's just how things were back then. Tash sat down and took off his boot to look again for the pebble that had been bothering him since setting out. He'd shaken and slapped the boot, but nothing ever came out. Finally he resorted to stuffing his hand down inside and groping the leather seams. Searching with his fingertips, he found a knobby bump of worn hide that might be the culprit, and was about to reach for his belt knife when he heard the screams. Even the roar of the falls wasn't sufficient to drown out the shrieks that cut across the river. Tesh's first thought was that the elves were burning a goat alive, a sacrifice or something. Anwar dropped his braid, his sight focused on the tower across the river. The animal cage had been opened. A group of elves came out of the tower carrying something, or trying to at least. It bucked, kicked, and screamed, and the shrieks were terrifying. One elf fell. The remaining ones dumped what they were carrying into the cage and slammed the gate closed. Not until they had did Tesh get a clear view of what was trapped inside. Sorry, Brigham, Tesh said. I think Meeks is going to have to wait. Chapter 15. The animal in the cage. I often wonder how that first meeting would have gone without the collar. The Book of Bryn Wanderly saw the horse and wagon as he approached the tower. The thing made him uneasy. Even the name was grating. Wagon was what the runes called it. The Frey had no word for a cart hauled by a horse. The word carry was sometimes used, but a carry or lift was a device traditionally used to move the powerful, the sick, or the old, and doing so never involved animals. Horses were noble creatures who allowed themselves to be ridden by worthy. Frey so lacked the room to dishonor and humiliate a majestic beast. The wheels of the wagon were different, they weren't solid discs, but rather a thin rim of curved metal with pole-like supports radiating out from the center. The contraption appeared inadequate to the task of holding up the cage. That too was a rune thing. Chariots, arrows, dragons, and the Orenfar were the for scourges that had plagued the Frey. None of them really originated with the runes. They were incapable of invention. In the same way sheep failed to grasp metal work, the Durg had taught them all these insidious tricks. The Durg, who continued to harbor hatred for losing a war that they had started out of greed. We really should kill them all as well. Penelope was wrong for not wiping out the Dug, and now her mistake has come back to plague us. The cowardly Durg had joined forces with the disgruntled Insteria, and together they yoked the rooms to fight for them. In a way, Montalu nearly felt sorry for the ruins. Nearly, how could anyone truly feel that way for a dumb animal? Montague saw a dark lump to one side of the cage. As he and Tree passed by on their way to the tower, he made out skin, straw, and hair. It was curled up like a dog. Is that the rune? Treya asked, hanging back. It's our rune, and as I doubt Jared has an assortment on hand, we can assume that is indeed the rune as well. Jared came out of the tower about the same time that Wanderlei and Treya paused to stare at the contents of the cage. The Kell of Avampartha had been in contact with Mondaleoff, and on all morning Jared was impatient and stressing the urgency of the mission. But Mondale believed the old Kell just wanted to get rid of the disgusting rune on his doorstep. The smell alone was enough to make him want to put as much distance between it and him as possible. He and Tree were downwind, and the odor was unmistakable, like a breeze blowing over the mouth of a pisspot. I'll be traveling with that for 3 days, he thought with a grimace. You took your sweet time, Jared barked as he shambled his way down the road. The old Kell and Montalia met halfway between the cage and the tower. The Kell looked older. How is that even possible? It's like water getting wetter or snow being colder. The Frey was no longer dusty. He was practically powder. The way he walked had a lot to do with that impression. The last time Wandel had seen him, Jared wasn't exactly doing backflips, but he'd walked normally enough. The old Frey coming at him now shuffled with one hand out for balance, as if he were navigating a tightrope. Each step appeared labored, and a sheen of sweat shone on his face. Perhaps there was another reason for the urgency. Wandela remembered visiting Fenelay in the weeks before she died. The old Fane couldn't walk. She had been bedridden and appeared withered and thin. Now Jared had that same look, transparent. He thought, as if the Kell was only partially in this world. Along with Jared came Indus and Crumb, both young Merilith, presumably on hand to catch the Kell should he fall. All three stood with askets flapping in the wind coming off the falls. We set out as soon as you instructed, Wonderlay replied. You know that. Jared scowled. Then you strolled your way here. Haven't I made it clear that the survival of Eraven hangs like a droplet? This wasn't the first time Wandela had heard this. Jared had been venting his frustration for days, using the art on the way there. Mondale was forced to listen to diatribes on how the prince was lazy and ultimately unworthy of the gift that Firil and Jared, mostly Jared, was handing him. But all those conversations had been waged in the privacy of his head. Montala thought Jared might be so old he forgot he'd already said this very thing just a few hours before, then realized the Kell remembered just fine. Jared wanted witnesses. What good were private insults? Ridicule was best delivered before an audience. Now take the room directly to your father. Let him know we are in desperate need of a dragon to hold the tower. This is new. Why? What's the problem? Your little mind isn't equipped to hold more than one thought at a time. So just remember to have the Fane send us a dragon as soon as he can. Wonderlay glanced at Indus and Krem. Hold on. Do you mean you want us to turn around right now? We just hiked all day. We're tired. I was planning to spend the night in Avampartha, have a decent meal, sleep in a bed, and set out tomorrow. Do you see? Jared said to Indus. Then he turned to Krem. This is what I'm dealing with. Wisely, neither Indus nor Krem offered so much as an expression in reply. You will take this room to Estermondan, Jared ordered, and you will travel with all due haste. Kill the horse if you have to, but get the room to the Fane. Impress upon him with your tired, bloodshot eyes how imperative it is that he get the secret and send help. Another Frey who looked like he might be a gaucho walked past them. And on down to where the cage was. He checked over the straps, holding the horse to the wagon, then gathered up the animal's lead and waited for Jordan to lay. "And don't take that collar off," Jared said, "and stay away from me, Marley, that fresh poison." Michael shook his head. He was breathing hard and looking desperate. For a moment Wandala thought he might cry. "If only I were younger. You need to do this, boy. You need to do this properly. Now go and save Erev and save our people." The Guidery held out the horse's lead toward Montaigne, which he promptly ordered Trar to take. He sighed, shook his head, and with one longing look at the tower said, "Let's go." When Suri became conscious again, the wagon was moving. She didn't think of it as waking because she hadn't fallen asleep. Sleep was a pleasant thing, a wonderful, satisfying end to a well-lived day. She had passed out at some point. Her mind and body mercifully gave way to the panic on her behalf as the wagon bumped and bounced, jostling side to side and banging over rocks and sticks. She opened her eyes to see that the nightmare had worsened. She tried to think of something else, something nice, something pretty. Instead, all that came to mind was the lack of air. The two wide sides of the wagon were open with large windows of narrow-set metal bars, allowing a cool breeze to blow through the cage. Despite this, Sora had trouble breathing. She focused on pulling in each breath, then pushing it back out, her eyes fixed on the bars that trapped her. Once again, her heart was thumping a rapid pace. She could feel the beat in her throat as it throbbed against the metal collar. Her hands hurt. She didn't know why. Her fingertips were bloody, and she spotted a red smear on the floor of the cage where a tiny bit of the wood had been stripped. A few of Suri's nails had white creases where they had bent back. Two of them still had splinters lodged underneath. Once more, Sora began to rock and moan. She tried not to. "It's just a box. It's better than the cell. I can feel the air. I won't be in here forever. They'll let me out soon. It's not like the last time when I couldn't even tell how long I'd been there." The voice in her head sounded reasonable, but those things didn't matter inside a small cage, nor would they to any sensible person chained to the bottom of a lake and told you will eventually be allowed to breathe. No matter how reassuringly or rationally the thought in her head presented the facts, she wasn't interested. Suri didn't want facts. She wanted out. It took all her concentration to resist throwing herself against the bars again or clawing at the floor. For hours she rolled along through a forest of beautiful trees, ancient behemoths. They ought to have soothed her, but the bars and the collar made them a separate reality, an image on a rolling wall. She was alone in a box she couldn't escape, so where the box was didn't matter at all. "She doesn't look good, sorry," heard a voice say in Frey. "Of course not. It's a room." "Well, yes, but what I mean is she looks sick or something." "Not well, at least." Suri lifted her head outside the bars, and walking alongside the wagon was a small female Frey. Her hair was surprisingly dark, most of it tucked up under a yellow wrap that exposed a long neck and oblong ears. She wasn't wearing an ascot, just a simple smock tunic and a cloak left open in the front so it hung like a cape. Not nearly as beautiful as Orion, this Frey lacked her grace and elegance, but her face at least looked kind. "You're an expert on animals now." The other voice came from somewhere ahead and out of Sari's view. "How much of an authority does one have to be to tell when someone is miserable?" She said this while staring at Suri with an intense pity that made the Frey's face wrinkle. "It's locked in a cage. All animals are miserable when trapped." "I don't know. I think she might be ill." "Do you think they fed her?" "Jared didn't even feed us, so I doubt he gave it any food." The phrase she couldn't see made an exasperated noise. "I can't believe he just turned us around like that. Couldn't he even spare me a bowl of soup?" "I think he was in a hurry because he's afraid she might die." "I think he was afraid he might die. Did you see him?" "My only hope is that Jared lives long enough for me to make his life a waking nightmare for mistreating me." So the Lady Frey came closer. She placed her hand on the bars, looking in her face, looked about to cry sorely, wondered why, then realized the Frey was a mirror reflecting what she saw, sympathetic and sad. The phrase searched Suri's eyes, then reached out. Suri opened her mouth to speak. "Hey!" The wagon lurched to a stop, jolting Suri forward. "Watch out, don't get so close. This thing is wild. It's likely to bite. Then you'll get some awful disease." Suri was an inch away from another panic attack. She dug the remains of her fingernails into the skin of her forearms. The pain kept her rooted, but it was a tenuous grip the Frey who had cautioned the other one came into view. He had a stick and clapped it against the bars, making them ring. Sorry, flinched Hasi, he said, and added a triumphant laugh. Just a dumb ruin Wonderlay, please don't, you're scaring. Her Wonderlay, the single word cut through the haze of her prison like a shining beacon. Suri forgot about the bars, the cage, and about being trapped. Her eyes came up and focused on him once more, and she remembered the prince who had come to Doloran Oman Dia, she whispered to herself. But the words were loud enough for them to hear. He drew back at the sound. Even without the art, Suri senses fear. She talks, the female said, blinking in amazement. You never said they could talk. You killed Orion. Suri glared at Montaigne. The prince recovered, gathered himself, and took a step closer. Yes, I did. He glanced at the Lady Frey, and in a lowered voice added, she was a traitor. I loved her. Suri told him. This caused both Ray to look at her in surprise. The female Frey continued to stare at her, astounded. She speaks so well. That's good. I hope Orion trained it sufficiently so it can tell my father about the secret of dragons. Suri heard laughter. For a moment she thought it was one of the Frey, but she was looking at them and neither made a sound. Why is she laughing? The female Frey asked Montague, realizing she was the one chuckling. Sari laughed all the harder. It felt good, the sound, the feeling, the look on their faces, all combined to push back the walls. She could breathe. Chapter 16. 6 dead, 1 captured. It has been said that nothing ever goes according to plan, but I guess that depends on whose plan. You are talking about the Book of Bryn captured. Are you sure? Asaphani asked. Tesh nodded. Saurdi walked into the tower. Fine enough, but something must have happened. A couple of days later she was brought out, and it definitely wasn't by her choice. Why do you say that? Tesh glanced at Edgar, and both of them frowned. She was screaming her head off as they dumped her inside a wagon, more like a cage. Edgar clarified. Yeah, what he said. She tried to fight them off, but couldn't. Not long after that an escort party came, and the wagon was pulled east into the forest. Eusephine reached out for the chair behind her, but missed. She staggered backward, nearly falling. She felt like Tish had stabbed her. Why didn't she stop them? Sorry, crushed beneath a mountain, collapsed a bridge at Allen wrist and held up the fortress walls in the Battle of Granford, but she did nothing as they carted her away. That doesn't make sense. That it came to her. The Orenfar, they were in the Koenig's Lodge. Nephrin had escorted the pair, announcing they had arrived with important news. Her husband had thought they should hear it together, and in private. He was right. As big as the tent was, it still felt crowded. Wind buffeted the canvas and rattled the sticks. Cold weather was coming. Tesh may have said more, but she didn't hear. Her mind returned to the conversation when he paused and said, also there's more. Nephrin asked. He had taken the news with less outward shock, but his voice and those words betrayed him. We lost 6 this trip. Meeks, Brinks, Ethan, Seth, Pritchard, as well as Onwar. Nephrin asked, his eyes darkening. How ambushed just before we left the forest on our way here. Nephrin stared hard at Tesh, but the Tekla continued to stand at attention. Anything else? No sir. Having found the chair, Hersephine sat down. She stared at the ground while running a hand over her face. Dismissed. She heard Nephrin tell his troops. Tish retreated from the tent, followed by Edgar, who seemed equally relieved to get out. The Teklas were back in the dragon camp after months in the wilderness. Having completed his report, he looked forward to better food, drink, and seeing Bryn, although not in that order. Edgar's priority must have been beer, because he headed toward the tent where barrels were stored. Tesh knew where to find Bryn, but he wanted to clean up first. All of them had returned wearing the forest of phrase that needed no explanation, covered in dirt and blood. He probably looked hideous and smelled worse. This wasn't how he wanted to greet her after being apart for so long. He veered toward the river, but word of their return must have spread, because he'd barely reached the healing quarter when she found him. She ran his way, one fist full of her pages. Somehow she managed to hold onto them as she tackled him. I missed you so much, she squealed between kisses and smoothing back his hair. They lay on the grass between a barrack tent and a stack of shields. She was wearing her Brecken, more the same one she always wore, he guessed, but it was hard to tell as all Ren folk used the same pattern and color of cloth. He liked the way she twisted the wrap tight around her waist, the shortness of the skirt, and how the folds gathered across her breasts. The old style had its charm, and Ren's plaid complemented Bryn's brown eyes. It's been ages since you left. I've worried about you every single day. Those joy-filled eyes, her hair spilling down in cascades to her shoulders. And that smile, she was so perfect. If only I heard you were in a meeting with. Persephone. Bryn's smile faded. How many this time? Just 5. After so long. Well, that's good. That's really good, isn't it? He shrugged. The elves are running out of fighters. Most of the ones we encounter now are little. More than kids. The menu lost. Was it anyone? She hesitated, her face strained. It wasn't Edgar or Atkins or no, all of them were new recruits. Mix Brinks. And that lot barely knew them really. I liked Meeks, Bryn said sadly. He always called me Mom. Tesh didn't want to talk about death. He didn't like seeing Bryn unhappy. He'd preferred to separate his two worlds. The Harwood was the ugly one. This was the beautiful. Seeing Bryn silhouetted above him was a pristine moment. His reward for his time in the wood. How's the book coming? He said, changing the subject. Bryn loved sharing it with him. Asking about it was the easiest way out of any awkward conversation. Did you finish the part with the Battle of Granford? An eager smile grew on her face. Oh yes, months ago. Came out real good too. I think. She gave a little shrug. Always a qualifier. The fear of displaying pride. Bryn was brilliant. Keepers had to be even ones who didn't learn how to transcribe language onto parchments. He loved her, but he hated Bryn's humility. Why can't you see how wonderful she is? The mindset didn't stop with just her. So many of those Tesh fought for were still ruins, miserable creatures who bowed without thought before those they no longer saw as gods, but still feared as if they were. They see pride as a deficiency instead of a birthright. Tell me some of it, he said, trying to look eager. Bryn seemed stunned. Really, right here now? Absolutely. A smile filled her face. Okay. She let him up and they sat together shoulder to shoulder. She sifted through the parchments, then stared at a page, running a finger across the marks. She mumbled, then shuffled again. You're the keeper of ways, and you can't remember the story? He asked. I remember all of them, but not the exact words. You don't have to be so precise, do you? She shot him a look as if he'd insulted her mother. Well, yeah, that's kind of the whole point. Once more she searched through the pages and found the part she had been looking for. They came with hardly a warning. Thousands, beautiful and terrible. They came across bridges of stone, wearing shining gold and shimmering blue. They came with powerful whirlwinds and giants, fire and death. They came, and nothing could stop them save honorable men. That's great, Tesh said, and meant it. He didn't remember her other stuff sounding so good. Her smile widened. You think so? Absolutely. It's really wonderful. Bryn, seriously, is all of it like that? She shrugged. I hope so. Tesh looked at all the sheets on her lap. Then you shouldn't be so careless. What do you mean? Get a bag or something? He started gathering the pages she had leafed through, straightening them with a gentle touch. Bryn stopped his efforts to move the pages around. He'd seen mothers less protective of newborns. Oh well, Roan has an idea to sew them together in sections, then put them between boards of wood wrapped in leather. But she can't until I'm done. You could have a bind to what she finished so far. It'll be better than losing pages. Bryn smiled awkwardly. I suppose. Hey, you know what? I could still show you how to read. I'm already teaching Tressa of all people. And she's. I don't have the time. Tish had to close that door fast. He didn't want to get her hopes up. But it's really not that hard. We could maybe after we're married. When will that be, by the way? Bryn asked, a sharpness edging into her voice. I don't know. Soon. Why not now? Roan and Gifford are married. Even Moya and Tekken live together. Meanwhile, I'm still tenting with Pedera. Don't you want us to be together? Wouldn't it be wonderful to fall asleep in each other's arms? To have children? Of course I want that, all of it. But I can't. Not yet. Why not? Bryn asked, entwining his arm with hers and laying her chin on his shoulder. I can't be a good husband and an effective soldier. I have to win this war first. You understand, don't you? He took a breath, and one of her hands. I watched the elves butcher my mother and father, saw them kill children, toddlers, who sat in the mud with tears streaking their dirty cheeks. I know, she cut in. Well, I don't want that happening to us. I can't have our kids going through that. Until this is over, I have to be out there. He pointed east toward the ghostly haze of trees. Part of why I'm so good is my willingness to take chances. I can't do that knowing I might end up abandoning you with a child. It'd make me hesitate, and that wouldn't put just my life at risk, but the lives of my men as well. You have to let me win this war. Then if I survive. He saw fear fill her eyes and added, and I will survive. That's when we can find a pretty place where I can hang up my sword and learn how to raise sheep and rye." But she brushed away a tear that was threatening to fall, then sighed. What Bryn shook her head. Nothing. Arguments drew lines on her face. She didn't agree, but didn't want to fight. Oh, her eyes brightened. "What about Suri? You might be a farmer earlier than you think. Did you get into Avimpartha? Did you see her?" He didn't want to answer. Bryn and Sari were friends. What she pressed. "What's wrong?" Holding back the tent flap, Nephrim stared at the sky that was clouding up again. Like anyone except maybe farmers, Nephrim preferred sunny days to rain, not because he enjoyed the light or warmth, or held a warrior's instinctual disdain for mud. Although all those things were true, he didn't like storms, because they reminded him of Mirrorleaf, this day's gray overcast. However, wasn't the result of magic. What rolled in that afternoon was a general dullness, a mirror casting back his own dreary disposition. By his most conservative calculations, he should have seen the Stramden burn 2 years ago. "You sent Suri to Avimpartha of all places," Nephrin said, while still looking out at the sky. "You didn't even discuss it with me. You wouldn't have agreed." "Of course not, and you shouldn't have either." Nephron regretted the statement even as the words left his lips. Not usually one for remorse, he was upset because he'd been trying so hard to keep his composure. He poured himself wine, aware he was drinking 2 jugs a day 5 years, and I'm still sitting in a tent while Lothian kicks his feet up on the forest throne. The whole situation was beyond absurd. It was unacceptable. Another winter is on its way, and I'm no closer than the last time snow fell. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Nephrin turned and let the flap fall, darkening the interior of the tent. "What were you expecting her to do?" "She went as an ambassador to discuss the possibility of peace. If that's what you wanted, you could have said anyone." "Why her of all people?" Tisiphone shook her head. "No, not anyone." Orion had always been convinced a meeting between Suri and the Fane could end the war. Besides, she was the only one the Fane was willing to talk to. He sadly shook his head. "Orion was a fool." "You are not, so I'm baffled. How could you agree?" Nephrin was angry. A boiling pot with a rattling lid, and yet he wasn't oblivious to Persephone's pain. She was already paying a high price for her mistake, and ranting wouldn't help. Instead, he forced his voice lower and spoke as gently as he could. "If the Fane truly wanted peace, he would have insisted on speaking to me. In his eyes, you're a traitor, and he specifically ruled you out." She paused a moment, then added, "And me as well." He made it quite clear that Sari was the only one he would speak to. The Fane considers all ruins to be little more than dumb animals. He'd never surrender to one. "We weren't talking about surrendering. We've had 6 years of killing hardships on both sides, but we can't get past the Ned Walden, and Lothian can't put a dent in our numbers. He sees the same thing I do. We've reached an impasse, and ending the war on mutually agreeable terms is the best solution." Nephrin sighed. "What the Fane sees is that he is a god. He had no intention of discussing a mutual peace. Doing so would be humiliating beyond imagination." Theophany looked confused. "Then why you still don't see it?" She stared at him, her eyes shifting back and forth. "He wants the secret to making dragons." Persephone shook her head. "It won't work. Suri won't be able to cast the weave." She was telling the truth about how the spell works. She would need to sacrifice someone dear. Few on this side of the river meet that requirement, and there's no one she loves east of the Ned Walden. She won't have to be the one who casts the spell. Nephrin said she only has to tell Lothian how to do it. Then he'll have his Merilith sacrifice their loved ones in a week. Maybe the skies will darken with fleets of dragons. Nephrin felt himself losing his struggle to keep his temper, so he moved to the exit. Pausing at the flap, he added, "By seeking peace, you've provided the Fane the victory that should have been ours. The war will end, but only after Lothian has swept us from the face of a land." Chapter 17. "Malcolm told me it would be easy for me to skip this part, especially since I am now in a hurry to get everything down. I could pretend that I believed her from the start, but that would be a lie, and I know now more than ever that lying is more than deceitful. It is dangerous." The Book of Bryn. "Sorry I'm late," Bryn called out as she ran, dodging around the tent ropes like she was a 10-year-old girl late for dinner. It's like she never grew up. Tressa thought with a mixture of amazement and irritation. Life wasn't fair, but somehow Bryn had escaped the poison that came with the pain, the little cruelties that shredded innocence and left behind hateful adults. Hadn't found a foothold in the girl, and yet Tressa knew the life Bryn had lived, and that left her puzzled. How does she do it? Tressa could never remember being. She struggled for a word that summed up Bryn. She couldn't. Naive was the closest, but that wasn't quite right. Young was another option, but she wasn't a child anymore. Bryn was 22 years old. There had been a celebration that spring. One of the few festivities held in the camp. Betrayal had made a cake and people danced and sang around the bonfire. Tressa hadn't been invited. She watched from the darkness, wondering what the cake tasted like. By Bryn's age, Tressa had already buried one husband, married a second, and lost 2 children. Neither of them made it past 8, not 8 years, 8 days. If she died along with the infants, maybe someone would have mourned her like they'd done when Arya died. Giving birth to Gifford, giving birth to children too weak to survive, was the hallmark of a bad mother. By 22, all of Tressa's dreams had been ground up like grain and blown away like chaff. She forgot how to smile, at least the happy version. But here was Bryn grinning and clutching that stupid book of hers like she didn't have a care. Bryn fell to her knees next to the water barrel that was stationed between the big spit and the laundry tubs. This was where they met every day so the keeper could teach Tressa to read. The spot wasn't very nice, but it was out of the way. Tressa had suffered through only a few lessons, and little of it was making sense. She understood the concept. An image stood for a sound. Problem was that Tressa couldn't fathom how anyone could memorize all the pairings. The more she learned, the more Tressa realized the project was hopeless. There was just too much. Bryn could likely do it because of her keeper's mind, something she'd trained for from a young age. Tressa had a hard time remembering when to spit and when to swallow, but she enjoyed her time with Bryn. I got distracted, Bryn said, puffing for air. Tess is back. I'm surprised you came at all. Then Bryn frowned as she set the pages on the ground. He's not why I'm late. And I can't stay. I just brought some pages that I thought you might practice with on your own. I really do have to get back. Where to the Keening's lodge? Bryn neatened the stack and put a rock on top to hold it against the breeze. Things have happened that I have to record. What sort of things? Bryn was already back on her feet, looking frustrated by the questions. Tressa could see the debate in the keeper's eyes. She wanted to leave, but hesitated. Then Tressa realized that Bryn didn't want to be rude to her. Tressa, that was like seeing a double rainbow. She'd heard about them, but had never actually seen one. What is it with her? It's like she doesn't live in the same reality we just found out. Sori's been captured by the Fray, Bryn said quickly. The whole thing is a mess. Sori was invited to the tower to talk about a possible peace, but it was a trick. We're trying to figure out what to do. Nefren thinks they're taking Sori to Estramadon, the elven capital city, which is even farther away. He believes they're going to force her to teach them how to make dragons. If they do well, it's not hard to figure out what that means. Persephone sent Justine from Moya, so I came here to drop off these pages. It won't take long, so I really do need to get back. Bryn took a breath, shaking her head and putting a hand over her mouth as if she might vomit, then said, Tess said they put Suri in a cage. Tressa said, yeah, so I'm Tressa. Are you all right? There has to be something we can do, Moya was saying from inside the tent as Tressa approached. Tressa had never visited the Kenig's tent before. She hadn't even spoken to Persephone since handing over Reglan's ring. Even then, all Tressa remembered having said was here. This meant the last time they had talked was when Persephone had lied about Conagher's death. She'd done it to be kind, which was pretty insane, considering Conagher had actually died trying to kill Persephone. Everyone knew about it and believed Tressa had been aware of the plot, a sentiment that didn't exactly endear her to the residents of Dowran. And it wasn't like she had ever been popular. Habit was crouched on the ground, fussing with the fire and staring up at her. What are you looking at? She growled. He shrugged and smiled. The simpleton was another of Dowran's misery dodgers. Like Bryn, the Morin of the Eternal Flame was immune to life's savagery's idiocy. Has its advantages. Tressa briefly considered announcing herself and asking permission to enter, but that would only give Moya the opportunity to say no. She couldn't let that happen. This was the first step, and the easiest. If she couldn't handle it, how could she ever manage the rest? Tressa pulled back the flap and entered inside. Persephone sat on a chair that Tressa had been brought from Alan Rist. Moira at her side. Bryn, who had returned to the clinic while Tressa was still working up the courage to come over, was on the floor where a half-written page indicated she'd already been taking notes. Nefren stood at the center of it, Everyone looked at her. Hello, she said stupidly. Tressa had nightmares like this where she walked into the middle of the camp naked. And everyone gawked. What are, Moya said as her eyes first widened and then narrowed. She took a step toward the entrance. I've got 2 seconds before she throws me out. So here goes. I know how to save Thori, she announced. Persephone caught Moya by the wrist and pulled her back. What did you say? You need to get across the river, right? I know how you do, Moya said in disbelief. How is it you even know something happened to Sori? I told her. Bryn said. She had a guilty look on her face as if she'd sinned against the gods. Moya didn't berate the keeper. She didn't take out a switch and whip the woman for her crime. Instead, the shield to the keening glared at Tressa as if she had corrupted the Pure One. You don't know tech. Get out of here, Tressa. No, wait, Persephone said. I want to hear this. Well, Tressa started knowing how crazy she was about to sound. There's a door that goes to Estrom something, the phrase capital city. That's where they're taking her, right? Persephone looked at Bryn, who looked at Moya, who said, you're culling drunk, aren't you? Tressa, whose bottle did you steal this time? Tressa ignored Moya. She had no chance with her. Instead, she kept her sights on Persephone. She was listening. That door is connected to an underground passageway, and its entrance is near a swamp not far from here. So if we go there, we can pop out of the fray door and save Suri. Nephron rolled his eyes. The women all stared, but not even Moira looked angry now. What Tressa saw was far worse than anger or hate. Their faces were painted in pity in a sad, pathetic voice that made even Tressa question herself. She added, I know it sounds crazy, but I'm not making it up. Malcolm told me about it. Persephone slowly nodded and said, thank you, Tressa. I appreciate you coming and telling us. The gentle tone made Tressa want to cry. She couldn't bear the thought of standing there bawling in front of them. She turned and ran out. Chapter 18. The mystery in the garden. The world of the fray is still such a puzzle to me, but now I know that much of it is a mystery to them. To the book of Bryn, Amali was filled with an odd combination of dread and elation when she spotted him in the garden, sitting on the same bench, the one directly across from the door. She had come in search of the odd stranger who called himself Treelos, but part of her hoped he wouldn't be there. In the same way someone suffering a toothache hoped the healer might be busy elsewhere. Over the years, Amali had seen her share of oddities. She'd witnessed whirlwinds tearing trees up by their roots, the moon blocking out the sun, foxfire in the forest, a winter without snow, and the Shannara River frozen solid. But all those things paled in comparison when she was 300 years and 14 days old. That was when the war with the Durg had started. 5 years later, Fenelay of the tribe Eloin began performing magic. The war had been raging ever since Fane Gika of the Ascend War had been murdered. Alan Rest of the Ansteria had become the new Fane and fought as best he could against the iron weapons. Then he too was killed, and the Durg marched unopposed with their massive army toward the Nidwolden and the Frey homeland. No one wanted the honor of being the last Fane, and Fenelay Myra was chosen without a challenger. 7 days after accepting the mantle of leadership, she stopped the army on the plains of Mater. She managed this all by herself, single-handedly killing tens of thousands and creating a mountain. In the process, no one questioned her methods. No one was even concerned. Fenelay was the Fane, and she had stopped the invasion. What was there to worry about? The Umulan leaders declared that she had been endowed with the gift of the art by Pharaoh in their time of need. Just as Glendora Fane had been given the horn in Phenolius's case, she was able to teach others her gift, and her students became known as Mirrorleaf, literally mirror followers. After that, Amali saw daily miracles. The sick and injured were magically healed. Trees were asked to grow in particular directions to accommodate buildings. Rivers temporarily flowed backward to aid the transport of supplies. Rain was scheduled and seasons tempered. Festivals were wondrous occasions, adorned with magical decorations and lights. For a time in the early centuries of Fane Fenelia's reign, it truly seemed as if Pharaoh had blessed them. It took a while before certain people started espousing that some Frey were more blessed than others. Penelopeus had saved the Frey from obliteration at the hands of King Midian, rescuing them at the last moment. For this, she was revered as a hero. But she had also released a poison into their society that slowly ate away at its foundation. Penelope had saved the leaves, but infected the roots. Two major mysteries surrounded her. The first was how she had obtained the gift of magic, and the second was why she had failed to fully obliterate the Durg, both centered on the garden and the Dor the official versions, as recounted by the Umulan high priest, said that Fenelay was rewarded with the art while kneeling before the door and praying to Firil for guidance later, when she had crushed King Midian and had driven her enemy back to their last stronghold of Dromondor. She once more visited the garden. There Firil asked her to show mercy toward the Durg, which she did. As a lifelong counselor in the Aquila, Emali knew a lie when she heard one. These weren't even good fabrications. They didn't have to be. When people needed to believe in something, they made allowances. Emali's problem was that she couldn't bend so far or delude herself with fantasies. She was the great-granddaughter of Glendora Fane, the curator of the Aquila, the sentinel and watchdog for a fragile system that had preserved their way of life for millennia. Panelias had broken Frey society, and it was Emali's responsibility to fix it. She viewed the door as the epicenter where everything had started. Set in a rock wall that enclosed an area a bit larger than the Orenthian, the door appeared to be made of simple wood and ordinary hinges. The Umulan priest said it was the gateway to the afterlife. Emali didn't believe that she saw it as just a symbol. The door most likely wasn't even a real opening, and it hung like a picture on a wall with nothing behind it. The idea of it was all that mattered. The door represented the difference between the living and the dead and embodied how a person could be barred from paradise if they failed to follow the law of Firil. This parable, for which the door was a physical reminder, taught that defying society would result in exclusion and banishment. Chaos was kept at bay by logic, but for those for whom reason was not enough, there was fear. All that was fine, perfect, even except that while the door was a wonderful symbol, it overachieved its goal. Not only couldn't the door be opened, which made perfect sense both metaphorically and physically, it also couldn't be harmed. No axe could cut it, no fire could burn it, and even the art was useless against the thing. As a symbol, the door was enduring, but as a door it was disturbing. So was the fellow who made a habit of sitting across from it. It had been almost 7 years, and yet he hadn't changed. Shiloh's remained in the same shoddy clothes, or at least ones that were similarly shoddy. Emali hadn't paid that much attention to his attire the first time. In any case, he looked as unkempt as ever. May I? She asked, indicating the open space next to him. Of course. Trilos slid a tad to the side to grant her more room. Emily took a moment to gather her robe before sitting. Thank you. Winter was coming, not cold yet, but trees were shedding. Falling leaves blew by, swirling and dancing in the corners. Are you always here? Emily asked. She didn't bother introducing herself or taking the time to mention they'd previously met. Their singular conversation had lasted for only a few minutes, but he'd known her then, so she expected he knew her now. Trilos, the door watcher, had known a great many things without being told. This was why she had sought him out. It's what I do, he said. Trellis didn't bother to look at her. He kept his eyes on the door as if afraid he might miss something. But why? Same reason you do what you do. He sat forward, his elbows on his knees in a most undignified slouch. His hands were together, fingers absently folding and unfolding, interacting like a pair of mating crabs. Mating crabs. Emily found her analogy bizarre. She'd never seen crabs copulate. She'd rarely even seen them at all. But perhaps that was the reason she'd conjured that thought. The way they moved was strange, exotic, unnatural. Still fascinated by his hands, she said, I administer the Aquila and advise the Fane on how best to rule his people in order to ensure our society remains safe. So why? And is that why you're here, to help your Fane? He asked, as if he didn't believe. As if he knew better. Emali gestured toward the door before them. I'm here as a worshipper of Firil, paying my respects to the door. Same as you. Chilos chuckled like his hands. The laughter was off somehow. Once more she had the impression that it was unnatural. Did I say something humorous? Comedy exists when truths and lies masquerade as each other. He leaned over, tilting his head slightly toward her, as if they were old pals. The act made her want to recoil, but she held steady. Every muscle in her body tensed, but no one could see that. At least she didn't think so. Everything you said was a lie, even the part you thought was true. That's what made it funny. She wished to ask more, to question him about his meditations on the mysteries of the door, but more than anything she wanted to know about the disappearance of Mongelet. That was the real reason she'd sought him. She couldn't, though not now. He'd just accused her of both ignorance and lying. Ignoring the comment would suggest agreement. Denying it would be defensible, as he had been completely correct. Admitting the falsehood would place her in a weakened position. declaring piety, before the door should have been a perfect and unassailable shield, and yet here she was beaten by her own defense. They had barely entered into the conversation, and already he had the upper hand. Amali had always considered herself a master of discourse and debate. At that moment she felt as if she were a child at the adult table. She went, and Trillo said, inexplicably freed by the unintelligible statement that blew the whole discussion off course, or at least from the direction she'd wanted to take it. Amali asked, "I'm sorry, what Penelopeus went in that door this time?" Was Amali's turn to laugh. "No, she didn't. I don't even think that's a real door. Oh, I assure you it is." "Then why can't anyone open it?" she asked. "It's locked." Emily chuckled at the simple but absurd statement. "No, it's not. There's no keyhole, no latch, no bar, not that kind of lock." He grinned at the door as if he and it shared a secret. "Because it's not that kind of door, so it's a magic door then, is it?" Amali's tone was condescending as she tried to regain her footing in the conversation. "Of course, but that's nothing unusual. The sun rising each morning is magical too." "That's not magic. The rising of the sun is a natural occurrence. What's natural about a ball of light rising up out of nowhere to illuminate and heat the world, then crossing the sky before falling back into nothing, and even more bizarrely, it'll do it again the next day? The only reason you don't see it as magical is because you're used to it. If you hadn't seen it happen, and do so every day since you were born, you'd think I was making the whole thing up. And when you saw it for the first time, you'd certainly believe it to be magic. The same could be said about snow or rain." He took his eyes off the door and looked up. "Everything that comes from the sky is magical, mysterious, and eternal." Reaching down, he scraped up a bit of dirt, lifted it, and let it fall. "The specks scattered in the wind, that which comes from Elon is fleeting, doomed from birth. The problem lies in those things that have common ancestry in both those made of dirt and sky, the unwanted children of warring parents. You are not from around here, are you not? Originally, no, I'm from the East. But then everyone is. They just don't know it. Everything started out there. Sadly, there isn't much left anymore. Neglectful tenants were left in charge and ruined the place. Where were you before? Here for a long time. I was in prison." "That's not a surprise, really." "Oh yes, why were you locked up?" Amali saw Trillo stumble. He paused, his eyes looking around in thought. Finally, he replied, "I honestly don't know." Then he looked at the door. "But I know who imprisoned me, and I intend to find him and repay the kindness. He's insane, or at the very least a fool." Amali wondered why it had taken so long to figure that out. Staring at a piece of wood all day should have been a huge clue. Even Valharic, for all of his piety, didn't do that. This understanding arrived with equal parts relief and disappointment. The healer, it appeared, was indeed out. She needn't be afraid or concerned about him watching her, something he had ominously mentioned at their other meeting. She also wouldn't be able to learn anything useful from him. She sighed and started to stand. "You're leaving? I thought you wanted to." "Know where Montaigne is?" Charlie said. "That's why you came, isn't it?" Amali sat back down as a dozen questions and hundreds of warnings popped into her head. But she focused on the opportunity presented. "Do you know he went to Avon Partha? Just him and Trayer." Trillos laughed again. "That's another farce, another truth pretending to be a lie. Although that one is a very bitter joke, cruelty is also a great source of humor. Everyone laughs when someone falls, don't they? Poor Traeger, it's one of the many reasons I have so little sympathy for Lothian. He believes making Traeger a servant to Mandalay was a virtuous act. He feels he was being kind." Trillos shook his head. "He was being compassionate in the same way that a thief leaves behind a loaf of bread after stealing all else." Amali had no idea what he was talking about. She thought she should sense there was a nugget of importance connected to that random comment. But this wasn't why she came. Why did Montaigne go to Avonmouth to fetch Arun? He's bringing her back to Daddy, showing off his princely chops. While Trillos might not be entirely sane, he did appear to have access to a surprising amount of information. "Why would he do that?" the Fane ordered him. Trilla smiled at her. "There's another joke in that. You have no idea what's happening despite playing such a large role in it." "I don't understand. What do you mean?" "Frustrating, isn't it?" he said, still focused on the door, his crab hands once more folding over each other, being the confused one. "I mean, he was right in pointing it out. Didn't help. Tell me what I did." "You told the Thane about the message from the Rome, the offer of peace." Feeling a dash of fear that Trillos might know a bit too much, Emily made a quick mental search of everyone who knew about her receiving the message from the Roan leader, she recalled, speaking of it openly. When Lothian first returned from the Battle of Graford, anyone could have heard me. Trilos continued. This gave the Fane the idea to use a pigeon to set a trap. He invited Aaron to come as a representative to talk about peace. But Lothian doesn't want that. He wants the secret, which is the rune that Mondale has been sent to fetch. Knows how to make dragons, or what Lothian thinks are dragons. The Fane intends to learn that from her. Amali nodded. I see. I doubt that. He said. He finally turned to look at her, or rather, I suspect you are seeing the wrong thing, which is, he smiled. But you didn't know why. You're recognizing the obvious but failing to put the pieces together. You remind me a bit of my sister, the older one, not the younger. He said this as if Amali invited his family over for parties on a regular basis. She was too smart for her own good, and yet often fails to put together the simplest connections. But you are both cunning and vicious, and that has served you too well. Amali noted that he spoke of his sister, the older, not the younger, in the past and present tenses. But given the whole of his statement, that was the least of her concerns. So what is it I'm missing? She asked. You don't have enough pieces on the board to achieve your goal. You're working with just enough to succeed. But plans never go as intended. You should anticipate setbacks. Complications always arise. You feel you're doing the best you can given your limited resources, but your best won't be good enough. You're going to need a second Merrily Thamali, or it isn't going to work. He knows about Macareta and what I plan to do with her, but that's impossible. I haven't told anyone what you are ignorant of. He said. What you are failing to realize is that the other mirror leaf doesn't need to be free. Did you find Montaigne? Macareta asked the moment Amali returned home. Is he okay? You shouldn't be so close to the door. What if I were someone else? Emily snapped, shutting the door quickly and loudly. I knew it was you. The art told me you can't use the art, she shouted. Macareta was lounging on the settee, her mouse slippers abandoned on the floor. 3 dirty teacups and a beach of crumbs littered the little table in front of her. I didn't use the art. The Merilith child grew angry, placing a hand on the back of the settee and straightening up. You just said so. No, you just don't understand how the art works. Amali took the time to properly hang up her cloak, as it gave her something sensible to do besides screaming. Enlighten me. Using the art is like talking, and yeah, if I did that, someone might hear me. But another part is listening. You can't notice someone listening. And why are you so mad right now? I'm not. The art is telling me. Oh, just stop it, will you? Emily, frustrated with a hook through her cloak across the room, shocking Macareta, who stared open-mouthed. A moment of silence reigned as they both stared at the sprawled garment on the floor. Okay, I'm a little worked up by. Is Montdella all right? The degree of concern that spewed from Macareta surprised Amali. The girl had used Mondale for her schemes. She'd unabashedly manipulated the prince, seduced him into betraying his own father. And yet is she trying to confuse me? Does Macareta think she can control me like she did him? He's fine, I suppose. What do you mean, you suppose? There it was again, that odd note of sincerity in her worried pretense. I mean that I have no reason to think anything unpleasant has happened, but I haven't personally verified that. Why? Where is he? Amali sighed and walked across the little room to pick up her cloak. His father sent him to escort a run prisoner back here to Estermadden. Oh, Macareta, previously puffed up by fear and anger, deflated, collapsed down on the settee into her usual slump. Then she looked at Amali with a perplexed expression. Wait, what's wrong? Then Amali placed the cloak on the hook. Turning back, she said, nothing. I have no idea. Chapter 19. In the land of Nog. I've always had a hard time throwing things away. Old clothes that are little more than rags, sandals with holes and broken straps, a wad of hopelessly tangled string. Even people who have hurt me, I cannot bring myself to throw them away, because as it turns out, sometimes I need them. The Book of Bryn Trusser tripped on a sledgehammer left outside for so long that it had been hidden by tall grass. If she had fallen, she would have smashed her face on the corner of the stone furnace. Typical. She was annoyed that her reward for trying to do something good was nearly having her teeth bashed in. Maybe I'm just not good at this kind of thing. Ron and Gifford's tent was at the center of the crafting quarter. Anvils circled it, as did piles of charcoal scraps, of metal crates of ore, and furnaces, some hot and cooking, others cold and waiting. People had taken to calling it the land of Nog, a place where Crimbles lived and all things miraculous could happen. A small single stall housed Narrated, whom Gifford had adopted and doted on. The horse acted as a stand-in for the child the couple lacked. Tressa didn't think that was because of any judgment from the gods, but more likely the result of Roan's intimacy issues. Things had gotten better between the potter and the inventor, and yet their relationship was far from perfect. Roan didn't recoil at Gifford's touch, but anyone could tell some things were still off limits. Everyone has troubles. Gifford's and Roan's are just more obvious than most. The tent glowed as if it were a monstrous firefly standing outside in the dark. Tessa went through the process of working up her nerve again. After the disaster at the Koenig's Lodge, she'd nearly given up on the idea of persuading others to come. She might have quit entirely if not for the memory of the silver ring. Malcolm had told those gathered in the smithy that everyone present that night had to do their part. Tessa was certain Malcolm didn't mean that she would be involved in saving the world, but he had, and she was in her entire life contributing that ring to the making of the sword. Was pathetic as it seemed her proudest moment. No one had asked her to hand it over, and need wasn't the reason she'd given it. Why she had was that of love and respect for a man she'd hardly known, and while even Tressa didn't know why she did it, Malcolm had known she would. Malcolm knew everything. In the autumn, several years from now, when everything has gone poorly, Tesh will bring news about the cage, and no one will know what to do. That's when you need to step forward. He hadn't actually said who she was supposed to tell. Tressa assumed he meant Persephone, but that hadn't worked out so well. Having tried, Tressa nearly choked the effort up as good enough, except she remembered something else Malcolm had said, and you'll have to take others with you, 7 to be exact. Just as she had once done with the ring, Tressa played with the idea that Malcolm was mistaken because she lacked faith not in him but in herself. Who will go anywhere with me? With no clear option, Tressa nearly set off alone, except I had doubted him before. Too crazy was only crazy until it happened. Ron and Gifford's tent felt a lot like the smithy, wonderfully nostalgic in an inexpressibly good way. Here was the best place for a last try. More than that, aside from Bryn's inexplicable interest in her, Ron and Gifford were the closest things she had to friends. I'll try one more time, she told the starry sky, cause I can't think of nothing else to do. But if this ain't good enough, then I guess you shouldn't have picked me.